Chapter 19 of the Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT. Chapter 19. Containing the achievements of the Knights of the Griffin and Crescent. Mr. Sycamore, alias the Knight of the Griffin, so denominated from a griffin painted on his shield, being armed at all points, and his friend Dawdle provided with a certain implement, which he flattered himself would ensure a victory over the novice Crow, they set out from the George, with their attendants, in all the elevation of hope, and pranced along the highway that led towards London, that being the road which our adventurer pursued. As they were extremely well mounted, and proceeded at a round pace, they, in less than 2 hours, came up with Sir Launcelot and his company, and Sycamore sent another formal defiance to the knight by his trumpeter, Dawdle having, for good reasons, declined that office. Our adventurer, hearing himself thus addressed, and seeing his rival, who had passed him, posted to obstruct his progress, armed cap a pee, with his lance in the rest, determined to give the satisfaction that was required, and desired that the regulations of the combat might be established. The Knight of the Griffin proposed that the vanquished party should resign all pretensions to Miss Aurelia Darnell in favour of the victor, that, while the principals were engaged, his friend Dawdle should run a tilt with Captain Crow, that Squire Crabshaw and Mr. Sycamore's servant should keep themselves in readiness to assist their respective masters occasionally, according to the law of arms, and that Mr. Clarke should observe the motions of the trumpeter, whose province was to sound the charge to battle. Our knight agreed to these regulations, notwithstanding the earnest and pathetic remonstrances of the young lawyer, who, with tears in his eyes, conjured all the combatants, in their turns, to refrain from an action that might be attended with bloodshed and murder, and was contrary to the laws both of God and man. In vain he endeavoured to move them by tears and entreaties, by threatening them with prosecutions in this world, and pains and penalties in the next. They persisted in their resolution, and his uncle would have begun hostilities on his carcass had he not been prevented by Sir Launcelot, who exhorted Clarke to retire from the field, that he might not be involved in the consequences of the combat. He relished this advice so well that he had actually moved off to some distance, but his apprehensions and concern for his friends, co-operating with an insatiable curiosity, detained him in sight of the engagement. The two knights having fairly divided the ground, and the same precautions being taken by the seconds on another part of the field, Sycamore began to be invaded with some scruples, which were probably engendered by the martial appearance and well-known character of his antagonist. The confidence which he derived from the reluctance of Sir Launcelot now vanished, because it plainly appeared that the knight's backwardness was not owing to personal timidity, and he foresaw that the prosecution of this joke might be attended with very serious consequences to his own life and reputation. He therefore desired a parley, in which he observed his affection for Miss Darnell was of such a delicate nature that should the discomfiture of his rival contribute to make her unhappy, his victory must render him the most miserable wretch upon earth. He proposed, therefore, that her sentiments and choice should be ascertained before they proceeded to extremity. Sir Launcelot declared that he was much more afraid of combating Aurelia's inclination than of opposing the Knight of the Griffin in arms, and that if he had the least reason to think Mr. Sycamore, or any other person, was distinguished by her preference, he would instantly give up his suit as desperate. At the same time he observed that Sycamore had proceeded too far to retract, that he had insulted a gentleman, and not only challenged, but even pursued him, and blocked up his passage in the public highway, outrages which he, Sir Launcelot, would not suffer to pass unpunished. Accordingly, he insisted on the combat, on pain of treating Sycamore as a craven and a recreant. This declaration was reinforced by Dawdle, who told him that should he now decline the engagement, all the world would look upon him as an infamous poltroon. These two observations gave a necessary fillip to the courage of the challenger. The parties took their stations. The trumpet sounded to charge, and the combatants began their career with great impetuosity. Whether the gleam of Sir Launcelot's arms affrighted Mr. Sycamore's steed, or some other object had an unlucky effect on his eyesight, certain it is he started at about midway, and gave his rider such a violent shake as discomposed his attitude, and disabled him from using his lance to the best advantage. Had our hero continued his career, with his lance couched, in all probability Sycamore's armour would have proved but a bad defence to his carcass. But Sir Launcelot, perceiving his rival's spear unrested, had just time to throw up the point of his own, when the two horses closed with such a shock that Sycamore, already wavering in the saddle, was overthrown, and his armour crashed around him as he fell. The victor, seeing him lie without motion, alighted immediately and began to unbuckle his helmet, in which office he was assisted by the trumpeter. When the headpiece was removed, the hapless knight of the Griffin appeared in the pale livery of death, though he was only in a swoon, from which he soon recovered by the effect of the fresh air and the aspersion of cold water brought from a small pool in the neighbourhood. When he recognized his conqueror doing the offices of humanity about his person, he closed his eyes from vexation, told Sir Launcelot that his was the fortune of the day, though he himself owed his mischance to the fault of his own horse, and observed that this ridiculous affair would not have happened but for the mischievous instigation of that scoundrel Dawdle, on whose ribs he threatened to revenge this mishap. Perhaps Captain Crow might have saved him the trouble, had the wag honourably adhered to the institutions of chivalry in his conflict with our novice. But on this occasion his ingenuity was more commendable than his courage. He had provided at the inn a blown bladder, in which several smooth pebbles were enclosed, and this he slyly fixed on the head of his pole, when the captain obeyed the signal of battle. Instead of bearing the brunt of the encounter, he turned out of the straight line, so as to avoid the lance of his antagonist, and rattled his bladder with such effect that Crow's horse, pricking up his ears, took to his heels, and fled across some ploughed land with such precipitation that the rider was obliged to quit his spear and lay fast hold on the mane, that he might not be thrown out of the saddle. Dawdle, who was much better mounted, seeing his condition, rode up to the unfortunate novice and belaboured his shoulders without fear of retaliation. Mr. Clark, seeing his kinsman so roughly handled, forgot his fears and flew to his assistance, but, before he came up, the aggressor had retired, and now perceiving that fortune had declared against his friend and patron, very honourably abandoned him in his distress, and went off at full speed for London. Nor was Timothy Crabshaw without his share in the noble achievements of this propitious day. He had by this time imbibed such a tincture of errantry that he firmly believed himself and his master equally invincible, and this belief operating upon a perverse disposition rendered him as quarrelsome in his sphere as his master was mild and forbearing. As he sat on horseback, in the place assigned to him and Sycamore's lackey, he managed Gilbert in such a manner as to invade with his heels the posteriors of the other's horse, and this insult produced some altercation which ended in mutual assault. The footman handled the butt end of his horsewhip with great dexterity about the head of Crabshaw, who declared afterwards that it sung and simmered like a kettle of codfish. But the squire, who understood the nature of long lashes, as having been a carter from his infancy, found means to twine his thong about the neck of his antagonist, and pull him off his horse half strangled, at the very instant his master was thrown by Sir Launcelot Greaves. Having thus obtained the victory, he did not much regard the punctilios of chivalry, but, taking it for granted he had a right to make the most of his advantage, resolved to carry off the spolia opima. Alighting with great agility, "Brother," cried he, "I think as on yo's been butcher's horse and don't carry calves well. I's make you know your churning days, I will. What, you look as if you were crow-trodden, you do. Now, you shall pay the score that you have been running on my pate, you shall, brother." So saying, he rifled his pockets, stripped him of his hat and coat, and took possession of his master's portmanteau. But he did not long enjoy his plunder, for the lackey complaining to Sir Launcelot of his having been despoiled, the knight commanded his squire to refund, not without menaces of subjecting him to the severest chastisement for his injustice and rapacity. Timothy represented, with great vehemence, that he had won the spoils in fair battle, at the expense of his head and shoulders, which he immediately uncovered, to prove his allegation. But his remonstrance having no effect upon his master, "Wounds," cried he, "as I mun gie thee back the pig, I's gie thee back the poke also. I'm a drubbing still in thy debt." With these words he made a most furious attack upon the plaintiff with his horsewhip, and before the knight could interpose, repaid the lackey with interest. As an appurtenance to Sycamore and Dawdle, he ran the risk of another assault from the novice Crow, who was so transported with rage at the disagreeable trick which had been played upon him by his fugitive antagonist, that he could not for some time pronounce an articulate sound, but a few broken interjections, the meaning of which could not be ascertained. Snatching up his pole, he ran towards the place where Mr. Sycamore sat on the ground, supported by the trumpeter, and would have finished what our adventurer had left undone, if the Knight of the Crescent, with admirable dexterity, had not warded off the blow which he aimed at the Knight of the Griffin, and signified his displeasure in a resolute tone. Then he collared the lackey, who was just disengaged from the chastising hand of Crabshaw, and swinging his lance with his other hand, encountered the squire's ribs by accident. Timothy was not slow in returning the salutation with the weapon which he still wielded. Mr. Clarke, running up to the assistance of his uncle, was opposed by the lackey, who seemed extremely desirous of seeing the enemy revenge his quarrel by falling foul of one another. Clarke, thus impeded, commenced hostilities against the footman, while Crow grappled with Crabshaw. A battle royal ensued, and was maintained with great vigour, and some bloodshed on all sides, until the authority of Sir Launcelot, reinforced by some weighty remonstrances applied to the squire, put an end to the conflict. Crabshaw immediately desisted, and ran roaring to communicate his grievances to Gilbert, who seemed to sympathise very little with his distress. The lackey took to his heels. Mr. Clarke wiped his bloody nose, declaring he had a good mind to put the aggressor in the Crown Office, and Captain Crow continued to ejaculate unconnected oaths, which, however, seemed to imply that he was almost sick of his new profession. "Down my eyes, if you call this, start me timbers, brother. Look ye, d'ye see, a lousy, lubberly, cowardly son of a... Among the breakers, d'ye see, lost my steerage way, split my binnacle, ball away, all arrantry. Give me a tight vessel, d'ye see, brother. Maybe you mayn't snatch my sea-room and a spanking gale. Odds heart, I'll hold a whole year's smite me limbs. It don't signify talking." Our hero consoled the novice for his disaster by observing that if he had got some blows he had lost no honour. At the same time he observed that it was very difficult, if not impossible, for a man to succeed in the paths of chivalry, who had passed the better part of his days in other occupations, and hinted that, as the cause which had engaged him in this way of life no longer existed, he was determined to relinquish a profession which, in a peculiar manner, exposed him to the most disagreeable incidents. Crow chewed the cud upon this insinuation, while the other personages of the drama were employed in catching the horses, which had given their riders the slip. As for Mr. Sycamore, he was so bruised by his fall that it was necessary to procure a litter for conveying him to the next town, and the servant was dispatched for this convenience, Sir Launcelot staying with him until it arrived. When he was safely deposited in the carriage, our hero took leave of him in these terms: "I shall not insist upon your submitting to the terms you yourself proposed before this rencontre. I give you free leave to use all your advantages, in an honourable way, for promoting your suit with a young lady of whom you profess yourself enamoured. Should you have recourse to sinister practices, you will find Sir Launcelot Greaves ready to demand an account of your conduct, not in the character of a lunatic knight-errant, but as a plain English gentleman, jealous of his honour, and resolute in his purpose." To this address Mr. Sycamore made no reply, but with a sullen aspect ordered the carriage to proceed, and it moved accordingly to the right, our hero's road to London lying in the other direction. Sir Launcelot, having already exchanged his armour for a riding-coat, hat, and boots, and Crow, parting with his skull-cap and leathern jerkin, regained in some respects the appearance of a human creature. Thus metamorphosed, they pursued their way in an easy pace. Mr. Clarke, endeavouring to amuse them with a learned dissertation on the law, tending to demonstrate that Mr. Sycamore was, by his behaviour on that day, liable to 3 different actions, besides a commission of lunacy, and that Dawdle might be prosecuted for having practised subtle craft to the annoyance of his uncle over and above an action for assault and battery, because, for why? The said Crow having run away, as might be easily proved, before any blows were given, the said Dawdle, by pursuing him even out of the high road, putting him in fear, and committing battery on his body, became to all intents and purposes the aggressor, and an indictment would lie in Banco Regis. The captain's pride was so shocked at these observations that he exclaimed with equal rage and impatience, "You lie, you dog! In Bilcom Regis, you lie, I say, you lubber! I did not run away, nor was I in fear, d'ye see? It was my son of a bitch of a horse that would not obey the helm, d'ye see, whereby I couldn't use my mettle, d'ye see? As for the matter of fear, you and fear may kiss my... So don't go and heave your stink-pots at my character, d'ye see? Or, agad, I'll trim thee fore and aft with her, I will." Tom protested he meant nothing but a little speculation, and Crow was appeased. In the evening they reached the town of Bugden without any further adventure, and passed the night in great tranquillity. Next morning, even after the horses were ordered to be saddled, Mr. Clarke, without ceremony, entered the apartment of Sir Launcelot, leading in a female, who proved to be the identical Mrs. Dolly Cowslip. This young lady, advancing to the knight, cried, "Oh, Sir Launcelot, my dear lady, my dear lady!" but was hindered from proceeding by a flood of tears, which the tender-hearted lawyer mingled with a plentiful shower of sympathy. Our adventurer, starting at this exclamation, "Oh, heavens!" cried he, "where is my Aurelia? Speak! Where did you leave that jewel of my soul? Answer me in a moment. I am all terror and impatience." Dolly, having recollected herself, told him that Mr. Darnell had lodged his niece in the new buildings by Mayfair; that, on the second night after their arrival, a very warm expostulation had passed between Aurelia and her uncle, who next morning dismissed Dolly, without permitting her to take leave of her mistress, and that same day moved to another part of the town, as she afterwards learned of the landlady, though she could not inform her whither they were gone; that when she was turned away, John Clump, one of the footmen, who pretended to have a kindness for her, had faithfully promised to call upon her and let her know what passed in the family; but as he did not keep his word, and she was an utter stranger in London, without friends or settlement, she had resolved to return to her mother, and travelled so far on foot since yesterday morning. Our knight, who had expected the most dismal tidings from her lamentable preamble, was pleased to find his presaging fears disappointed, though he was far from being satisfied with the dismission of Dolly, from whose attachment to his interest, joined to her influence over Mr. Clump, he had hoped to reap such intelligence as would guide him to the haven of his desires. After a minute's reflection, he saw it would be expedient to carry back Mrs. Cowslip and lodge her at the place where Mr. Clump had promised to visit her with intelligence, for, in all probability, it was not for want of inclination that he had not kept his promise. Dolly did not express any aversion to the scheme of returning to London, where she hoped once more to rejoin her dear lady, to whom by this time she was attached by the strongest ties of affection, and her inclination in this respect was assisted by the consideration of having the company of the young lawyer, who, it plainly appeared, had made strange havoc in her heart, though it must be owned, for the honour of this blooming damsel, that her thoughts had never once deviated from the paths of innocence and virtue. The more Sir Launcelot surveyed this agreeable maiden, the more he felt himself disposed to take care of her fortune; and from this day he began to ruminate on a scheme which was afterwards consummated in her favour. In the meantime, he laid injunctions on Mr. Clarke to conduct his addresses to Mrs. Cowslip according to the rules of honour and decorum, as he valued his countenance and friendship. His next step was to procure a saddle-horse for Dolly, who preferred this to any other sort of carriage, and thereby gratified the wish of her admirer, who longed to see her on horseback in her green Joseph. The armour, including the accoutrements of the novice and the squire, were left in the care of the innkeeper, and Timothy Crabshaw was so metamorphosed by a plain livery frock that even Gilbert with difficulty recognized his person. As for the novice Crow, his head had almost resumed its natural dimensions, but then his whole face was so covered with a livid suffusion, his nose appeared so flat, and his lips so tumefied, that he might well have passed for a Caffre or Ethiopian. Every circumstance being now adjusted, they departed from Bugden in a regular cavalcade, dined at Hatfield, and in the evening arrived at the Bull and Gate Inn in Holborn, where they established their quarters for the night. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT. Chapter 20, in which our hero descends into the mansion of the damned. The first step which Sir Launcelot took in the morning that succeeded his arrival in London was to settle Mrs. Dolly Cowslip in lodgings at the house where John Clump had promised to visit her, as he did not doubt that, though the visit was delayed, it would some time or other be performed, and in that case he might obtain some intelligence of Aurelia. Mr. Thomas Clarke was permitted to take up his habitation in the same house, on his earnestly desiring he might be entrusted with the office of conveying information and instruction between Dolly and our adventurer. The knight himself resolved to live retired until he should receive some tidings relating to Miss Darnell that should influence his conduct, but he proposed to frequent places of public resort incognito, that he might have some chance of meeting by accident with the mistress of his heart. Taking it for granted that the oddities of Crow would help to amuse him in his hours of solitude and disappointment, he invited that original to be his guest at a small house, which he determined to hire ready furnished, in the neighbourhood of Golden Square. The captain thanked him for his courtesy, and frankly embraced his offer, though he did not much approve of the knight's choice in point of situation. He said he would recommend him to a special good upper deck hard by St. Catherine's in Wapping, where he would be delighted with the prospect of the street forwards, well frequented by passengers, carts, drays, and other carriages, and having backwards an agreeable view of Alderman Parson's great brewhouse, with 200 hogs feeding almost under the window. As a further inducement, he mentioned the vicinity of the Tower guns, which would regale his hearing on days of salutation, nor did he forget the sweet sound of mooring and unmooring ships in the river, and the pleasing objects on the other side of the Thames, displayed in the oozy docks and cabbage gardens of Rotherhithe. Sir Launcelot was not insensible to the beauties of this landscape, but, his pursuit lying another way, he contented himself with a less enchanting situation, and Crow accompanied him out of pure friendship. At night Mr. Clarke arrived at our hero's house with tidings that were by no means agreeable. He told him that Clump had left a letter for Dolly, informing her that his master, Squire Darnell, was to set out early in the morning for Yorkshire, but he could give no account of her lady, who had the day before been conveyed he knew not whither in a hackney coach, attended by her uncle and an ill-looking fellow, who had much the appearance of a bailiff or turnkey, so that he feared she was in trouble. Sir Launcelot was deeply affected by this intimation. His apprehension was even roused by a suspicion that a man of Darnell's violent temper and unprincipled heart might have practised upon the life of his lovely niece, but, upon recollection, he could not suppose that he had recourse to such infamous expedients, knowing as he did that an account of her would be demanded at his hands, and that it would be easily proved he had conveyed her from the lodging in which she resided. His first fears now gave way to another suggestion, that Anthony, in order to intimidate her into a compliance with his proposals, had trumped up a spurious claim against her, and, by virtue of a writ, confined her in some prison or sponging house. Possessed with this idea, he desired Mr. Clarke to search the sheriff's office in the morning, that he might know whether any such writ had been granted, and he himself resolved to make a tour of the great prisons belonging to the metropolis, to inquire if perchance she might not be confined under a borrowed name. Finally, he determined if possible to apprise her of his place of abode by a paragraph in all the daily papers, signifying that Sir Launcelot Greaves had arrived at his house near Golden Square. All these resolutions were punctually executed. No such writ had been taken out in the sheriff's office, and therefore our hero set out on his jail expedition, accompanied by Mr. Clarke, who had contracted some acquaintance with the commanding officers in these garrisons in the course of his clerkship and practice as an attorney. The first day they spent in prosecuting their inquiry through the Gatehouse Fleet and Marshalsea. The next day they allotted to the King's Bench, where they understood there was a great variety of prisoners. There they proposed to make a minute scrutiny, by the help of Mr. Norton, the deputy marshal, who was Mr. Clarke's intimate friend, and had nothing at all of the gaoler, either in his appearance or in his disposition, which was remarkably humane and benevolent towards all his fellow creatures. The knight, having bespoke dinner at a tavern in the Borough, was, together with Captain Crow, conducted to the prison of the King's Bench, which is situated in St. George's Fields, about a mile from the end of Westminster Bridge, and appears like a neat little regular town, consisting of one street, surrounded by a very high wall, including an open piece of ground, which may be termed a garden, where the prisoners take the air and amuse themselves with a variety of diversions. Except the entrance, where the turnkeys keep watch and ward, there is nothing in the place that looks like a gaol, or bears the least colour of restraint. The street is crowded with passengers. Tradesmen of all kinds here exercise their different professions. Hawkers of all sorts are admitted to call and vend their wares as in any open street of London. Here are butchers' stands, chandlers' shops, a surgery, a tap-house, well frequented, and a public kitchen, in which provisions are dressed for all the prisoners gratis, at the expense of the publican. Here the voice of misery never complains, and, indeed, little else is to be heard but the sounds of mirth and jollity. At the farther end of the street, on the right hand, is a little paved court, leading to a separate building, consisting of 12 large apartments, called state-rooms, well furnished, and fitted up for the reception of the better sort of Crown prisoners; and, on the other side of the street, facing a separate division of ground, called the common side, is a range of rooms occupied by prisoners of the lowest order, who share the profits of a begging-box, and are maintained by this practice and some established funds of charity. We ought also to observe that the gaol is provided with a neat chapel, in which a clergyman, in consideration of a certain salary, performs divine service every Sunday. Our adventurer, having searched the books, and perused the description of all the female prisoners who had been for some weeks admitted into the gaol, obtained not the least intelligence of his concealed charmer, but resolved to alleviate his disappointment by the gratification of his curiosity. Under the auspices of Mr. Norton, he made a tour of the prison, and in particular visited the kitchen, where he saw a number of spits loaded with a variety of provision consisting of butcher's meat, poultry, and game. He could not help expressing his astonishment with uplifted hands, and congratulating himself in secret upon his being a member of that community which had provided such a comfortable asylum for the unfortunate. His ejaculation was interrupted by a tumultuous noise in the street, and Mr. Norton, declaring he was sent for to the lodge, consigned our hero to the care of one Mr. Felton, a prisoner of a very decent appearance, who paid his compliments with a good grace, and invited the company to repose themselves in his apartment, which was large, commodious, and well furnished. When Sir Launcelot asked the cause of that uproar, he told him that it was the prelude to a boxing match between 2 of the prisoners, to be decided in the ground or garden of the place. Captain Crow, expressing an eager curiosity to see the battle, Mr. Felton assured him there would be no sport, as the combatants were both reckoned dunghills. "But in half an hour," said he, "there will be a battle of some consequence between 2 of the demagogues of the place, Dr. Crabclaw and Mr. Tapley, the first a physician and the other a brewer. You must know, gentlemen, that this microcosm, or republic in miniature, is like the great world, split into factions. Crabclaw is the leader of one party, and the other is headed by Tapley. Both are men of warm and impetuous tempers, and their intrigues have embroiled the whole place, insomuch that it was dangerous to walk the street on account of the continual skirmishes of their partisans. At length, some of the more sedate inhabitants, having met and deliberated upon some remedy for these growing disorders, proposed that the dispute should be at once decided by single combat between the two chiefs, who readily agreed to the proposal. The match was accordingly made for 5 guineas, and this very day and hour appointed for the trial, on which considerable sums of money are depending. As for Mr. Norton, it is not proper that he should be present, or seem to countenance such violent proceedings, which, however, it is necessary to connive at, as convenient vents for the evaporation of those humours which, being confined, might accumulate and break out with greater fury in conspiracy and rebellion. The knight owned he could not conceive by what means such a number of licentious people, amounting, with their dependents, to above 500, were restrained within the bounds of any tolerable discipline, or prevented from making their escape, which they might at any time accomplish either by stealth or open violence, as it could not be supposed that 1 or 2 turnkeys, continually employed in opening and shutting the door, could resist the efforts of a whole multitude. "Your wonder, good sir," said Mr. Felton, "will vanish when you consider it is hardly possible that the multitude should co-operate in the execution of such a scheme, and that the keeper perfectly well understands the maxim divide et impera. Many prisoners are restrained by the dictates of gratitude towards the deputy marshal, whose friendship and good offices they have experienced. Some, no doubt, are actuated by motives of discretion. One party is an effectual check upon the other, and I am firmly persuaded that there are not 10 prisoners within the place that would make their escape if the doors were laid open. This is a step which no man would take, unless his fortune was altogether desperate, because it would oblige him to leave his country for life, and expose him to the most imminent risk of being retaken and treated with the utmost severity. The majority of the prisoners live in the most lively hope of being released by the assistance of their friends, the compassion of their creditors, or the favour of the legislature. Some who are cut off from all these proposals are become naturalized to the place, knowing they cannot subsist in any other situation. I myself are one of these. After having resigned all my effects for the benefit of my creditors, I have been detained these 9 years in prison, because one person refuses to sign my certificate. I have long outlived all my friends from whom I could expect the least countenance or favour. I am grown old in confinement, and lay my account with ending my days in gaol, as the mercy of the legislature in favour of insolvent debtors is never extended to uncertified bankrupts taken in execution. By dint of industry and the most rigid economy, I make shift to live independent in this retreat. To this scene my faculty of subsisting, as well as my body, is peculiarly confined. Had I an opportunity to escape, where should I go? All my views of fortune have been long blasted. I have no friends nor connections in the world. I must therefore starve in some sequestered corner, or be recaptivated and confined for ever to close prison, deprived of the indulgences which I now enjoy." Here the conversation was broke off by another uproar, which was the signal to battle between the doctor and his antagonist. The company immediately adjourned to the field, where the combatants were already undressed and the stakes deposited. The doctor seemed of the middle age and middle stature, active and alert, with an atrabilious aspect, and a mixture of rage and disdain expressed in his countenance. The brewer was large, raw-boned, and round as a butt of beer, but very fat, unwieldy, short-winded, and phlegmatic. Our adventurer was not a little surprised when he beheld, in the character of seconds, a male and female stripped naked from the waist upwards, the latter ranging on the side of the physician. But the commencement of the battle prevented his demanding of his guide an explanation of this phenomenon. The doctor, retiring some paces backwards, threw himself into the attitude of a battering ram, and rushed upon his antagonist with great impetuosity, foreseeing that, should he have the good fortune to overturn him in the first assault, it would not be an easy task to raise him up again and put him in a capacity of offence. But the momentum of Crabclaw's head and the concomitant efforts of his knuckles had no effect upon the ribs of Tapley, who stood firm as the Acroceraunian promontory, and stepping forward with his projected fist, something smaller and softer than a sledge-hammer, struck the physician to the ground. In a trice, however, by the assistance of his female second, he was on his legs again, and grappling with his antagonist, endeavoured to tip him a fall; but instead of accomplishing his purpose, he received a cross-buttock, and the brewer, throwing himself upon him as he fell, had well nigh smothered him on the spot. The Amazon flew to his assistance, and Tapley showing no inclination to get up, she smote him on the temple till he roared. The male second, hastening to the relief of his principal, made application to the eyes of the female, which were immediately surrounded with black circles, and she returned the salute with a blow which brought a double stream of blood from his nostrils, greeting him at the same time with the opprobrious appellation of a lousy son of a b. A combat more furious than the first would now have ensued, had not Felton interposed with an air of authority, and insisted on the man's leaving the field, an injunction which he forthwith obeyed, saying, "Well, damme, Felton, you are my friend and commander. I'll obey your order, but the b will be foul of me before we sleep." Then Felton, advancing to his opponent, "Madam," said he, "I am very sorry to see a lady of your rank and qualifications expose yourself in this manner. For God's sake, behave with a little more decorum, if not for the sake of your own family, at least for the credit of your sex in general." "Hark ye, Felton," said she, "decorum is founded upon a delicacy of sentiment and deportment, which cannot consist with the disgraces of a jail and the miseries of indigence. But I see the dispute is now terminated, and the money is to be drank. If you'll dine with us, you shall be welcome. If not, you may die in your sobriety, and he damned." By this time the doctor had given out, and allowed the brewer to be the better man. Yet he would not honour the festival with his presence, but retired to his chamber, exceedingly mortified at his defeat. Our hero was reconducted to Mr. Felton's apartment, where he sat some time without opening his mouth, so astonished he was at what he had seen and heard. "I perceive, sir," said the prisoner, "you are surprised at the manner in which I accosted that unhappy woman; and perhaps you will be more surprised when you hear that within these 18 months she was actually a person of fashion, and her opponent, who by the by is her husband, universally respected as a man of honour and a brave officer." "I am indeed," cried our hero, overwhelmed with amazement and concern, as well as stimulated by an eager curiosity to know the fatal causes which have produced such a reverse of character and fortune. "But I will rein my curiosity till the afternoon, if you will favour me with your company at a tavern in the neighbourhood, where I have bespoke dinner, a favour which I hope Mr. Norton will have no objection to your granting, as he himself is to be of the party." The prisoner thanked him for his kind invitation, and they adjourned immediately to the place, taking up the deputy marshal in their passage through the lodge or entrance of the prison. Chapter 20. Chapter 21. of the life and adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT. Chapter 21. Containing further anecdotes relating to the children on wretchedness. Dinner being cheerfully discussed, and our adventurer expressing an eager desire to know the history of the male and female who had acted as squires or seconds to the champions of the King's Bench, Felton gratified his curiosity to this effect. All that I know of Captain Clewline, previous to his commitment, is that he was a commander of a sloop of war, and bore the reputation of a gallant officer; that he married the daughter of a rich merchant in the city of London, against the inclination and without the knowledge of her father, who renounced her for this act of disobedience; that the captain consoled himself for the rigour of the parent with the possession of the lady, who was not only remarkably beautiful in person, but highly accomplished in her mind and amiable in her disposition. Such, a few months ago, were those two persons whom you saw acting in such a vulgar capacity. When they first entered the prison, they were undoubtedly the handsomest couple mine eyes ever beheld, and their appearance won universal respect even from the most brutal inhabitants of the gaol. The captain, having unwarily involved himself as a security for a man to whom he had lain under obligations, became liable for a considerable sum, and his own father-in-law being the sole creditor of the bankrupt, took this opportunity of wreaking vengeance upon him for having espoused his daughter. He watched an opportunity until the captain had actually stepped into the post-chaise with his lady for Portsmouth, where his ship lay, and caused him to be arrested in the most public and shameful manner. Mrs. Clewline had like to have sunk under the first transports of her grief and mortification, but these subsiding, she had recourse to personal solicitation. She went with her only child in her arms, a lovely boy, to her father's door, and, being denied admittance, kneeled down in the street, imploring his compassion in the most pathetic strain. But this hard-hearted citizen, instead of recognizing his child and taking the poor mourner to his bosom, insulted her from the window with the most bitter reproach, saying, among other shocking expressions, "Strumpet, take yourself away with your brat, otherwise I shall send for the beadle, and have you to Bridewell." The unfortunate lady was cut to the heart by this usage, and fainted in the street, from whence she was conveyed to a public house by the charity of some passengers. She afterwards attempted to soften the barbarity of her father by repeated letters, and by interesting some of his friends to intercede with him in her behalf; but all her endeavours proving ineffectual, she accompanied her husband to the prison of the King's Bench, where she must have felt, in the severest manner, the fatal reverse of circumstance to which she was exposed. The captain being disabled from going to sea, was superseded, and he saw all his hopes blasted in the midst of an active war, at a time when he had the fairest prospects of fame and fortune. He saw himself reduced to extreme poverty, cooped up with the tender partner of his heart in a wretched hovel, amidst the refuse of mankind, and on the brink of wanting the common necessaries of life. The mind of man is ever ingenious in finding resources. He comforted his lady with vain hopes of having friends who would effect his deliverance, and repeated assurances of this kind so long that he at length began to think they were not altogether void of foundation. Mrs. Clewline, from a principle of duty, recollected all her fortitude, that she might not only bear her fate with patience, but even contribute to alleviate the woes of her husband, whom her affection had ruined. She affected to believe the suggestions of his pretended hope. She interchanged with him assurances of better fortune. Her appearance exhibited a calm, while her heart was torn with anguish. She assisted him in writing letters to former friends, the last consolation of the wretched prisoner. She delivered these letters with her own hand, and underwent 1,000 mortifying repulses, the most shocking circumstances of which she concealed from her husband. She performed all the menial offices in her own little family, which was maintained by pawning her apparel, and both the husband and wife, in some measure, sweetened their cares by prattling and toying with their charming little boy, on whom they doted with an enthusiasm of fondness. Yet even this pleasure was mingled with the most tender and melancholy regret. I have seen the mother hang over him with the most affecting expression of this kind in her aspect, the tears contending with the smiles upon her countenance, while she exclaimed, "Alas, my poor prisoner, little did your mother once think she should be obliged to nurse you in a jail." The captain's paternal love was dashed with impatience. He would snatch up the boy in a transport of grief, press him to his breast, devour him as it were with kisses, throw up his eyes to heaven in the most emphatic silence, then convey the child hastily to his mother's arms, pull his hat over his eyes, stalk out into the common walk, and, finding himself alone, break out into tears and lamentation. Ah! Little did this unhappy couple know what further griefs awaited them. The smallpox broke out in the prison, and poor Tommy Clewline was infected. As the eruption appeared unfavourable, you may conceive the consternation with which they were overwhelmed. Their distress was rendered inconceivable by indigence, for by this time they were so destitute that they could neither pay for common attendance nor procure proper advice. I did on that occasion what I thought my duty towards my fellow creatures. I wrote to a physician of my acquaintance, who was humane enough to visit the poor little patient. I engaged a careful woman prisoner as a nurse, and Mr. Norton supplied them with money and necessaries. These helps were barely sufficient to preserve them from the horrors of despair, when they saw their little darling panting under the rage of a loathsome pestilential malady during the excessive heat of the dog days, and struggling for breath in the noxious atmosphere of a confined cabin, where they scarce had room to turn on the most necessary occasions. The eager curiosity with which the mother eyed the doctor's looks as often as he visited the boy, the terror and trepidation of the father while he desired to know his opinion, in a word, the whole tenor of their distress baffled all description. At length the physician, for the sake of his own character, was obliged to be explicit, and returning with the captain to the common walk, told him, in my hearing, that the child could not possibly recover. This sentence seemed to have petrified the unfortunate parent, who stood motionless and seemingly bereft of sense. I led him to my apartment, where he sat a full hour in that state of stupefaction. Then he began to groan hideously. A shower of tears burst from his eyes. He threw himself on the floor, and uttered the most piteous lamentation that ever was heard. Meanwhile, Mrs. Norton, being made acquainted with the doctor's prognostic, visited Mrs. Clewline, and invited her to the lodge. Her prophetic fears immediately took the alarm. "What!" cried she, starting up with a frantic wildness in her looks. "Then our case is desperate. I shall lose my dear Tommy. The poor prisoner will be released by the hand of heaven. Death will convey him to the cold grave." The dying innocent, hearing this exclamation, pronounced these words: "Tommy won't leave you, my dear mamma. If death comes to take Tommy, papa shall drive him away with his sword." This address deprived the wretched mother of all resignation to the will of Providence. She tore her hair, dashed herself on the pavement, shrieked aloud, and was carried off in a deplorable state of distraction. That same evening the lovely babe expired, and the father grew frantic. He made an attempt on his own life, and, being with difficulty restrained, his agitation sunk into a kind of sullen insensibility, which seemed to absorb all sentiment, and gradually vulgarized his faculty of thinking. In order to dissipate the violence of his sorrow, he continually shifted the scene from one company to another, contracted abundance of low connections, and drowned his cares in repeated intoxication. The unhappy lady underwent a long series of hysterical fits and other complaints, which seemed to have a fatal effect on her brain as well as constitution. Cordials were administered to keep up her spirits, and she found it necessary to protract the use of them to blunt the edge of grief by overwhelming reflection, and remove the sense of uneasiness arising from a disorder in her stomach. In a word, she became a habitual dram drinker, and this practice exposed her to such communication as debauched her reason and perverted her sense of decorum and propriety. She and her husband gave a loose to vulgar excess, in which they were enabled to indulge by the charity and interest of some friends, who obtained half pay for the captain. They are now metamorphosed into the shocking creatures you have seen, he into a riotous plebeian, and she into a ragged trull. They are both drunk every day, quarrel and fight one with another, and often insult their fellow prisoners. Yet they are not wholly abandoned by virtue and humanity. The captain is scrupulously honest in all his dealings, and pays off his debts punctually every quarter, as soon as he receives his half pay. Every prisoner in distress is welcome to share his money while it lasts, and his wife never fails, while it is in her power, to relieve the wretched, so that their generosity, even in this miserable disguise, is universally respected by their neighbours. Sometimes the recollection of their former rank comes over them like a qualm, which they dispel with brandy, and then humorously rally one another on their mutual degeneracy. She often stops me in the walk, and pointing to the captain says, "My husband, though he is become a blackguard jailbird, must be allowed to be a handsome fellow still." On the other hand, he will frequently desire me to take notice of his rib, as she chances to pass. "Mind that draggle-tailed drunken drab," he will say. "What an antidote it is! Yet, for all that, Felton, she was a fine woman when I married her. Poor Bess! I have been the ruin of her, that is certain, and deserve to be d—d for bringing her to this pass." Thus they accommodate themselves to each other's infirmities, and pass their time not without some taste of plebeian enjoyment. But name their child, they never fail to burst into tears, and still feel a return of the most poignant sorrow. Sir Launcelot Greaves did not hear this story unmoved. Tom Clark's cheeks were bedewed with the drops of sympathy, while, with much sobbing, he declared his opinion that an action should lie against the lady's father. Captain Crow, having listened to the story with uncommon attention, expressed his concern that an honest seaman should be so taken in stays, but he imputed all his calamities to the wife. "For why," said he, A seafaring man may have a sweetheart in every port, but he should steer clear of a wife, as he would avoid a quicksand. You see, brother, how this here clew-line lags astern in the wake of a snivelling otherwise he would never make a weft in his ensign for the loss of a child. Odds heart, he could have done no more if he had sprung a topmast or started a timber." The knight declaring that he would take another view of the prison in the afternoon, Mr. Felton insisted upon his doing him the honour to drink a dish of tea in his apartment, and Sir Launcelot accepted his invitation. Thither they accordingly repaired, after having made another circuit of the gaol, and the tea things were produced by Mrs. Felton when she was summoned to the door, and in a few minutes returning, communicated something in a whisper to her husband. He changed colour, and repaired to the staircase, where he was heard to talk aloud in an angry tone. When he came back, he told the company he had been teased by a very importunate beggar. Addressing himself to our adventurer, "You took notice," says he, "of a fine lady flaunting about our walk in all the frippery of the fashion. She was lately a gay young widow that made a great figure at the court end of the town. She distinguished herself by her splendid equipage, her rich liveries, her brilliant assemblies, her numerous routs, and her elegant taste in dress and furniture. She is nearly related to some of the best families in England, and, it must be owned, mistress of many fine accomplishments. But being deficient in true delicacy, she endeavoured to hide that defect by affectation. She pretended to 1,000 antipathies which did not belong to her nature. A breast of veal threw her into mortal agonies. If she saw a spider, she screamed, and at sight of a mouse she fainted away. She could not, without horror, behold an entire joint of meat, and nothing but fricassees and other made dishes were seen upon her table. She caused all her floors to be lined with green baize, that she might trip along there with more ease and pleasure. Her footmen wore clogs, which were deposited in the hall, and both they and her chairmen were laid under the strongest injunctions to avoid porter and tobacco. Her jointure amounted to £800 per annum, and she made shift to spend 4 times that sum. At length it was mortgaged for nearly the entire value, but, far from retrenching, she seemed to increase in extravagance, until her effects were taken in execution, and her person here deposited in safe custody. When one considers the abrupt transition she underwent from her spacious apartments to a hovel scarce 8 feet square, from sumptuous furniture to bare benches, from magnificence to meanness, from affluence to extreme poverty, one would imagine she must have been totally overwhelmed by such a sudden gush of misery. But this was not the case. She has, in fact, no delicate feelings. She forthwith accommodated herself to the exigency of her fortune, yet she still affects to keep state amidst the miseries of a gaol, and this affectation is truly ridiculous. She lies abed till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She maintains a female attendant for the sole purpose of dressing her person. Her cabin is the least cleanly in the whole prison. She has learned to eat bread and cheese and drink porter, but she always appears once a day dressed in the pink of the fashion. She has found means to run in debt at the chandler's shop, the baker's, and the tap house, though there is nothing got in this place but with ready money. She has even borrowed small sums from divers prisoners, who were themselves on the brink of starving. She takes pleasure in being surrounded with duns, observing, that by such people a person of fashion is to be distinguished. She writes circular letters to her former friends and acquaintance, and by this method has raised pretty considerable contributions, for she writes in a most elegant and irresistible style. About a fortnight ago she received a supply of 20 guineas, when, instead of paying her little gaol debts, or withdrawing any part of her apparel from pawn, she laid out the whole sum in a fashionable suit and laces, and next day borrowed of me a shilling to purchase a neck of mutton for her dinner. She seems to think her rank in life entitles her to this kind of assistance. She talks very pompously of her family and connections, by whom, however, she has been long renounced. She has no sympathy nor compassion for the distresses of her fellow creatures, but she is perfectly well bred. She bears a repulse the best of any woman I ever knew, and her temper has never once been ruffled since her arrival at the King's Bench. She now entreated me to lend her half a guinea, for which she said she had the most pressing occasion, and promised upon her honour it should be repaid to-morrow. But I lent a deaf ear to her request, and told her in plain terms that her honour was already bankrupt. Sir Launcelot, thrusting his hand mechanically into his pocket, pulled out a couple of guineas, and desired Felton to accommodate her with that trifle in his own name. But he declined the proposal, and refused to touch the money. "God forbid," said he, "that I should attempt to thwart your charitable intention. But this, my good sir, is no object. She has many resources. Neither should we number the clamorous beggar among those who really feel distress. He is generally gorged with bounty misapplied. The liberal hand of charity should be extended to modest want that pines in silence, encountering cold, nakedness, and hunger, and every species of distress. Here you may find the wretch of keen sensations blasted by accident in the blossom of his fortune, shivering in the solitary recess of indigence, disdaining to beg, and even ashamed to let his misery be known. Here you may see the parent who has known happier times, surrounded by his tender offspring, naked and forlorn, demanding food, which his circumstances cannot afford. That man, of decent appearance and melancholy aspect, who lifted his hat as you passed him in the yard, is a person of unblemished character. He was a reputable tradesman in the city, and failed through inevitable losses. A commission of bankruptcy was taken out against him by his sole creditor, a Quaker, who refused to sign his certificate. He has lived 3 years in prison, with a wife and 5 small children. In a little time after his commitment, he had friends who offered to pay 10 shillings in the pound of what he owed, and to give security for paying the remainder in 3 years by instalments. The honest Quaker did not charge the bankrupt with any dishonest practices, but he rejected the proposal with the most mortifying indifference, declaring that he did not want his money. The mother repaired to his house, and kneeling before him with her 5 lovely children, implored mercy with tears and exclamations. He stood this scene unmoved, and even seemed to enjoy the prospect, wearing the looks of complacency while his heart was steeled with rancour. "Woman," said he, "these be hopeful babes, if they were duly nurtured. Go thy ways in peace. I have taken my resolution." Her friends maintained the family for some time, but it is not in human charity to persevere. Some of them died, some of them grew unfortunate, some of them fell off, and now the poor man is reduced to the extremity of indigence, from whence he has no prospect of being retrieved. The 4th part of what you would have bestowed upon the lady would make this poor man and his family sing with joy. He had scarce pronounced these words, when our hero desired the man might be called, and in a few minutes he entered the apartment with a low obeisance. "Mr. Colby," said the knight, "I have heard how cruelly you have been used by your creditor, and beg you will accept this trifling present, if it can be of any service to you in your distress." So saying, he put 5 guineas into his hand. The poor man was so confounded at such an unlooked-for acquisition, that he stood motionless and silent, unable to thank the donor; and Mr. Felton conveyed him to the door, observing that his heart was too full for utterance. But in a little time his wife, bursting into the room with her 5 children, looked around, and going up to Sir Launcelot without any direction, exclaimed, "This is the angel sent by Providence to succour me and my poor innocents." Then falling at his feet, she pressed his hand and bathed it with her tears. He raised her up with that complacency which was natural to his disposition. He kissed all her children, who were remarkably handsome and neatly kept, though in homely apparel, and giving her his direction, assured her she might always apply to him in her distress. After her departure, he produced a bank note of £20, and would have deposited it in the hands of Mr. Felton, to be distributed in charities among the objects of the place. But he desired it might be left with Mr. Norton, who was the proper person for managing his benevolence, and he promised to assist the deputy with his advice in laying it out. Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT. Chapter 22. In which Captain Crow is sublimed into the regions on astrology. 3 whole days had our adventurer prosecuted his inquiry about the amiable Aurelia, whom he sought in every place of public and of private entertainment or resort, without obtaining the least satisfactory intelligence, when he received one evening, from the hands of a porter, who instantly vanished, the following billet: "If you would learn the particulars of Miss Darnell's fate, fail not to be in the fields by the Foundling Hospital precisely at 7 o'clock this evening, when you shall be met by a person who will give you the satisfaction you desire, together with his reason for addressing you in this mysterious manner." Had this intimation concerned any other subject, perhaps the knight would have deliberated with himself in what manner he should take a hint so darkly communicated. But his eagerness to retrieve the jewel he had lost divested him of all his caution. The time of assignation was already at hand, and neither the captain nor his nephew could be found to accompany him, had he been disposed to make use of their attendance. He therefore, after a moment's hesitation, repaired to the place appointed, in the utmost agitation and anxiety lest the hour should be elapsed before his arrival. Crow was one of those defective spirits who cannot subsist for any length of time on their own bottoms. He wanted a familiar prop, upon which he could disburden his cares, his doubts, and his humours; an humble friend who would endure his caprices, and with whom he could communicate free of all reserve and restraint. Though he loved his nephew's person and admired his parts, he considered him often as a little petulant jackanapes, who presumed upon his superior understanding. And as for Sir Launcelot, there was something in his character that overawed the seaman and kept him at a disagreeable distance. He had, in this dilemma, cast his eyes upon Timothy Crabshaw, and admitted him to a considerable share of familiarity and fellowship. These companions had been employed in smoking a social pipe at an alehouse in the neighbourhood, when the knight made his excursion, and returning to the house about supper time, found Mr. Clarke in waiting. The young lawyer was alarmed when he heard the hour of 10 without seeing our adventurer, who had been used to be extremely regular in his economy, and the captain and he supped in profound silence. Finding, upon inquiry among the servants, that the knight went out abruptly, in consequence of having received a billet, Tom began to be visited with the apprehension of a duel, and sat the best part of the night by his uncle, sweating with the expectation of seeing our hero brought home a breathless corpse. But no tidings of him arriving, he, about 2 in the morning, repaired to his own lodging, resolved to publish a description of Sir Launcelot in the newspapers, if he should not appear next day. Crow did not pass the time without uneasiness. He was extremely concerned at the thought of some mischief having befallen his friend and patron, and he was terrified with the apprehensions that, in case Sir Launcelot was murdered, his spirit might come and give him notice of his fate. Now he had an insuperable aversion to all correspondence with the dead, and taking it for granted that the spirit of his departed friend could not appear to him except when he should be alone, and abed in the dark, he determined to pass the remainder of the night without going to bed. For this purpose, his first care was to visit the garret in which Timothy Crabshaw lay fast asleep, snoring with his mouth wide open. Him the captain with difficulty roused, by dint of promising to regale him with a bowl of rum punch in the kitchen, where the fire, which had been extinguished, was soon rekindled. The ingredients were fetched from a public-house in the neighbourhood, for the captain was too proud to use his interest in the knight's family, especially at these hours, when all the rest of the servants had retired to their repose. And he and Timothy drank together until daybreak, the conversation turning upon hobgoblins and God's revenge against murder. The cookmaid lay in a little apartment contiguous to the kitchen, and whether disturbed by these horrible tales of apparitions, or titillated by the savoury steams that issued from the punch-bowl, she made a virtue of necessity, or appetite, and dressing herself in the dark, suddenly appeared before them, to the no small perturbation of both. Timothy, in particular, was so startled that, in his endeavours to make a hasty retreat towards the chimney-corner, he overturned the table. The liquor was spilt, but the bowl was saved by falling on a heap of ashes. Mrs. Cook, having reprimanded him for his foolish fear, declared she had got up betimes in order to scour her saucepans, and the captain proposed to have the bowl replenished if materials could be procured. This difficulty was overcome by Crabshaw, and they sat down with their new associate to discuss the second edition. The knight's sudden disappearing being brought upon the carpet, their female companion gave it as her opinion that nothing would be so likely to bring this affair to light as going to a cunning man, whom she had lately consulted about a silver spoon that was mislaid, and who told her all the things that she ever did and ever would happen to her through the whole course of her life. Her two companions pricked up their ears at this intelligence, and Crow asked if the spoon had been found. She answered in the affirmative, and said the cunning man described to a hair the person that should be her true lover and her wedded husband, that he was a seafaring man, that he was pretty well stricken in years, a little passionate or so, and that he went with his fingers clinched like, as it were. The captain began to sweat at this description, and mechanically thrust his hands into his pockets, while Crabshaw, pointing to him, told her he believed she had got the right sow by the ear. Crow grumbled that mayhap, for all that, he should not be brought up by such a grappling neither. Then he asked if this cunning man dealt with the devil, declaring, in that case, he would keep clear of him. For why? Because he must have sold himself to Old Scratch. And being a servant of the devil, how could he be a good subject to his majesty? Mrs. Cook assured him the conjurer was a good Christian, and that he gained all his knowledge by conversing with the stars and planets. Thus satisfied, the two friends resolved to consult him as soon as it should be light, and being directed to the place of his habitation, set out for it by 7 in the morning. They found the house forsaken, and had already reached the end of the lane in their return, when they were accosted by an old woman, who gave them to understand that if they had occasion for the advice of a fortune-teller, as she did suppose they had, from their stopping at the house where Dr. Grubble lived, she would conduct them to a person of much more eminence in that profession. At the same time she informed them that the said Grubble had been lately sent to Bridewell, a circumstance which, with all his art, he had not been able to foresee. The captain, without any scruple, put himself and his companion under convoy of this beldame, who, through many windings and turnings, brought them to the door of a ruinous house standing in a blind alley, which door, having opened with a key drawn from her pocket, she introduced them into a parlour, where they saw no other furniture than a naked bench and some frightful figures on the bare walls, drawn, or rather scrawled, with charcoal. Here she left them locked in until she should give the doctor notice of their arrival, and they amused themselves with deciphering these characters and hieroglyphics. The first figure that engaged their attention was that of a man hanging upon a gibbet, which both considered as an unfavourable omen, and each endeavoured to avert from his own person. Crabshaw observed that the figure so suspended was clothed in a sailor's jacket and trousers, a truth which the captain could not deny, but, on the other hand, he affirmed that the said figure exhibited the very nose and chin of Timothy, together with the hump on one shoulder. A warm dispute ensued, and being maintained with much acrimonious altercation, might have dissolved the new cemented friendship of those two originals, had it not been interrupted by the old sibyl who, coming into the parlour, intimated that the doctor waited for them above. She likewise told them that he never admitted more than one at a time. This hint occasioned a fresh contest. The captain insisted upon Crabshaw's making sail ahead in order to look out afore, but Timothy persisted in refusing this honour, declaring he did not pretend to lead, but he would follow, as in duty bound. The old gentlewoman abridged the ceremony by leading out Crabshaw with one hand and locking up Crow with the other. The former was dragged upstairs like a bear to the stake, not without reluctance and terror, which did not at all abate at the sight of the conjurer, with whom he was immediately shut up by his conductress, after she had told him in a whisper that he must deposit a shilling in a little black coffin, supported by a human skull and thigh bones crossed, on a stool covered with black baize, that stood in one corner of the apartment. The squire, having made this offer with fear and trembling, ventured to survey the objects around him, which were very well calculated to augment his confusion. He saw divers skeletons hung by the head, the stuffed skin of a young alligator, a calf with 2 heads, and several snakes suspended from the ceiling, with the jaws of a shark and a starved weasel. On another funeral table he beheld 2 spheres, between which lay a book open, exhibiting outlandish characters and mathematical diagrams. On one side stood an inkstandish with paper, and behind this desk appeared the conjurer himself, in sable vestments, his head so overshadowed with hair that, far from contemplating his features, Timothy could distinguish nothing but a long white beard, which, for aught he knew, might have belonged to a four-legged goat as well as to a two-legged astrologer. This apparition, which the squire did not eye without manifest discomposure, extended a white wand, made certain evolutions over the head of Timothy, and having muttered an ejaculation, commanded him, in a hollow tone, to come forward and declare his name. Crabshaw, thus adjured, advanced to the altar, and whether from design or, which is more probable, from confusion, answered, "Samuel Crow." The conjurer, taking up the pen, and making a few scratches on the paper, exclaimed, in a terrific accent, "How, miscreant, attempt to impose upon the stars? You look more like a crab than a crow, and was born under the sign of Cancer." The squire, almost annihilated by this exclamation, fell upon his knees, crying, "I pray you, my lord conjurer's worship, pardon my ignorance, and don't go to bind me over to the Red Sea like. I's a poor Yorkshire tyke, and would no more cheat the stars than I'd cheat me own father, as the saying is, and must be a good hand at trapping that catches the stars a napping. But as your honour's worship observed, my name is Tim Crabshaw, of the East Riding, groom and squire to Sir Launcelot Greaves, Baron Knight, an arrant knight, who ran mad for a wench, as your worship's conjuration well knoweth. The person below is Captain Crow, and we come by Marjorie Cook's recommendation, to seek after my master, who is gone away, or made away, the Lord he knows how and where." Here he was interrupted by the conjurer, who exhorted him to sit down and compose himself till he should cast a figure. Then he scrawled the paper, and waving his wand, repeated abundance of gibberish concerning the number, the names, the houses, and revolutions of the planets, with their conjunctions, oppositions, signs, circles, cycles, trines, and trigons. When he perceived that this artifice had its proper effect in disturbing the brain of Crabshaw, he proceeded to tell him from the stars that his name was Crabshaw, or Crabscraw, that he was born in the East Riding of Yorkshire, of poor yet honest parents, and had some skill in horses; that he served a gentleman whose name began with the letter G, which gentleman had run mad for love and left his family, but whether he would return alive or dead, the stars had not yet determined. Poor Timothy was thunderstruck to find the conjurer acquainted with all these circumstances, and begged to know if he might be so bold as to ask a question or two about his own fortune. The astrologer pointing to the little coffin, our squire understood the hint, and deposited another shilling. The sage had recourse to his book, erected another scheme, performed once more his airy evolutions with the wand, and having recited another mystical preamble, expounded the book of fate in these words: "You shall neither die by war nor water, by hunger or by thirst, nor be brought to the grave by old age or distemper, but let me see, ay, the stars will have it so, you shall be exalted, ha! Ay, that is, hanged for horse stealing." "Oh, good my lord conjurer," roared the squire, "I'd as lief give 40 shillings as be hanged." "Peace, sirrah!" cried the other. "Would you contradict or reverse the immutable decrees of fate? Hanging is your destiny, and hanged you shall be. And comfort yourself with the reflection that as you are not the first, so neither will you be the last to swing on Tyburn Tree." This comfortable assurance composed the mind of Timothy, and in a great measure reconciled him to the prediction. He now proceeded in a whining tone to ask whether he should suffer for the first fact, whether it be for a horse or a mare, and of what colour, that he might know when his hour was come. The conjurer gravely answered that he would steal a dappled gelding on a Wednesday, be cast at the Old Bailey on Thursday, and suffer on a Friday. And he strenuously recommended it to him to appear in the cart with a nosegay in one hand and the whole duty of man in the other. "But if in case it should be in the winter," said the squire, "when a nosegay can't be had?" "Why then," replied the conjurer, "an orange will do as well." These material points being adjusted to the entire satisfaction of Timothy, he declared he would bestow another shilling to know the fortune of an old companion, who truly did not deserve so much at his hands, but he could not help loving him better than e'er a friend he had in the world. So saying, he dropped a third offering in the coffin, and desired to know the fate of his horse Gilbert. The astrologer, having again consulted his art, pronounced that Gilbert would die of the staggers, and his carcass be given to the hounds, a sentence which made a much deeper impression upon Crabshaw's mind than did the prediction of his own untimely and disgraceful fate. He shed a plenteous shower of tears, and his grief broke forth in some passionate expressions of tenderness. At length he told the astrologer he would go and send up the captain, who wanted to consult him about Margery Cook, because as how she had informed him that Dr. Grubble had described just such another man as the captain for her true love, and he had no great stomach to the match, if so be as the stars were not bent upon their coming together. Accordingly, the squire being dismissed by the conjurer, descended to the parlour with a rueful length of face, which being perceived by the captain, he demanded, "What cheer, ho?" with some signs of apprehension. Crabshaw making no return to this salute, he asked if the conjurer had taken an observation and told him anything. Then the other replied he had told him more than he desired to know. "Why, and that be the case?" said the seaman. "I have no occasion to go aloft this trip, brother." This evasion would not serve his turn. Old Tisiphone was at hand, and led him up growling into the hall of audience, which he did not examine without trepidation. Having been directed to the coffin, where he presented half a crown, in hope of rendering the fates more propitious, the usual ceremony was performed, and the doctor addressed him in these words: "Approach, Raven." The captain advancing, "You ain't much mistaken, brother," said he. "Heave your eye into the binnacle and box your compass. You'll find I'm a crow, not a raven, though if indeed they be both fowls of a feather, as the saying is." "I know it," cried the conjurer. "Thou art a northern crow, a sea crow, not a crow of prey, but a crow to be preyed upon, a crow to be plucked, to be flayed, to be basted, to be broiled by Margery upon the gridiron of matrimony." The novice changing colour at this denunciation, "I do understand your signals, brother," said he, "and if it be set down in the logbook of fate that we must grapple, well then wear timbers. But as I know how the land lies, d'ye see, and the current of my inclination sets me off, I shall haul up close to the wind, and mayhap we shall clear Cape Margery. But howsomever we shall leave that reef in the foretopsail. I was bound upon another voyage, d'ye see, to look and to see, and to know if so be as how I could pick up any intelligence along shore concerning my friend Sir Launcelot, who slipped his cable last night and has lost company, d'ye see." "What!" exclaimed the cunning man. "Art thou a crow, and canst not smell carrion? If thou wouldst grieve for Greaves, behold his naked carcass lies unburied to feed the kites, the crows, the gulls, the rooks, and ravens." "What, broached too?" "Dead as a boiled lobster." "Odds heart, friend, these are the heaviest tidings I've heard these 7 long years. There must have been deadly odds when he lowered his topsails. Smite my eyes! I'd rather the Mufti had foundered at sea with myself and all my generation on board. Well, fare thy soul, flower of the world. Had honest Sam Crow been within hail? But what signifies palavering?" Here the tears of unaffected sorrow flowed plentifully down the furrows of the seaman's cheeks. Then his grief giving way to his indignation, "Harkee, brother conjurer," said he, "you can spy foul weather before it comes in your eyes. Why did you not give us warning of this here squall? Dust my limbs! I'll make ye give an account of this here damned, horrid, confounded murder, d'ye see? Mayhap you yourself was concerned, d'ye see? For my part, brother, I put my trust in God, and steer by the compass, and I value not your paw-wawing and your conjuration of a rope's end, d'ye see?" The conjurer was by no means pleased either with the matter or the manner of this address. He therefore began to soothe the captain's choler, by representing that he did not pretend to omniscience, which was the attribute of God alone, that human art was fallible and imperfect, and all that it could perform was to discover certain partial circumstances of any particular object to which its inquiries were directed. That being questioned by the other man concerning the cause of his master's disappearing, he had exercised his skill upon the subject, and found reason to believe that Sir Launcelot was assassinated. That he should think himself happy in being the instrument of bringing the murderers to justice, though he foresaw they would of themselves save him that trouble, for they would quarrel about dividing the spoil, and one would give information against the other. The prospect of this satisfaction appeased the resentment and in some measure mitigated the grief of Captain Crow, who took his leave without much ceremony, and being joined by Crabshaw, proceeded with a heavy heart to the house of Sir Launcelot, where they found the domestics at breakfast, without exhibiting the least symptom of concern for their absent master. Crow had been wise enough to conceal from Crabshaw what he had learned of the knight's fate. This fatal intelligence he reserved for the ear of his nephew, Mr. Clarke, who did not fail to attend him in the forenoon. As for the squire, he did nothing but ruminate in rueful silence upon the dappled gelding, the nosegay, and the predicted fate of Gilbert. Him he forthwith visited in the stable, and saluted with the kiss of peace. Then he bemoaned his fortune with tears, and by the sound of his own lamentation was lulled asleep among the litter. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT. Chapter 23. In which the clouds that cover the catastrophe begin to disperse. We must now leave Captain Crow and his nephew Mr. Clarke arguing with great vehemence about the fatal intelligence obtained from the conjurer, and penetrate at once the veil that concealed our hero. Know then, reader, that Sir Launcelot Greaves, repairing to the place described in the billet which he had received, was accosted by a person muffled in a cloak, who began to amuse him with a feigned story of Aurelia, to which, while he listened with great attention, he found himself suddenly surrounded by armed men, who seized and pinioned down his arms, took away his sword, and conveyed him by force into a hackney coach provided for the purpose. In vain he expostulated on this violence with 3 persons who accompanied him in the vehicle. He could not extort one word by way of reply, and from their gloomy aspects he began to be apprehensive of assassination. Had the carriage passed through any frequented place, he would have endeavoured to alarm the inhabitants, but it was already clear of the town, and his conductors took care to avoid all villages and inhabited houses. After having travelled about 2 miles, the coach stopped at a large iron gate, which being opened, our adventurer was led in silence through a spacious house into a tolerably decent apartment, which he understood was intended for his bedchamber. In a few minutes after his arrival, he was visited by a man of no very prepossessing appearance, who, endeavouring to smooth his countenance, which was naturally stern, welcomed our adventurer to his house, exhorted him to be of good cheer, assuring him he should want for nothing, and desired to know what he would choose for supper. Sir Launcelot, in answer to this civil address, begged he would explain the nature of his confinement, and the reasons for which his arms were tied like those of the worst malefactor. The other postponed till tomorrow the explanation he demanded, but in the meantime unbound his fetters, and, as he declined eating, left him alone to his repose. He took care, however, in retiring, to double lock the door of the room, whose windows were grated on the outside with iron. The knight, being thus abandoned to his own meditations, began to ruminate on the present adventure with equal surprise and concern. But the more he revolved circumstances, the more was he perplexed in his conjectures. According to the state of the mind, a very subtle philosopher is often puzzled by a very plain proposition, and this was the case of our adventurer. What made the strongest impression upon his mind was a notion that he was apprehended on suspicion of treasonable practices, by a warrant from the Secretary of State, in consequence of some false, malicious information, and that his prison was no other than the house of a messenger, set apart for the accommodation of suspected persons. In this opinion he comforted himself by recollecting his own conscious innocence, and reflecting that he should be entitled to the privilege of habeas corpus, as the act including that inestimable jewel was happily not suspended at this time. Consoled by this self-assurance, he quietly resigned himself to slumber. But before he fell asleep, he was very disagreeably undeceived in his conjecture. His ears were all at once saluted with a noise from the next room, conveyed in distinct bounces against the wainscot. Then a hoarse voice exclaimed, "Bring up the artillery! Let Brutendorf's brigade advance! Detach my black hussars to ravage the country! Let them be new booted! Take particular care of the spur leathers! Make a desert of Lusatia! Bombard the suburbs of Peria! Go! Tell my brother Henry to pass the Elbe at Meissen with 40 battalions and 50 squadrons. So ho, you Major General Donder, why don't you finish your second parallel? Send hither the engineer Schittenbach. I'll lay all the shoes in my shop. The breach will be practicable in 24 hours. Don't tell me of your works. You and your works be damned." "Assuredly," cried another voice from a different quarter, "he that thinks to be saved by works is in a state of utter reprobation. I myself was a profane weaver, and trusted to the rottenness of works. I kept my journeymen and prentices at constant work, and my heart was set upon the riches of this world, which was a wicked work. But now I have got a glimpse of the new light, I feel the operations of grace. I am of the new birth. I abhor good works. I detest all working but the working of the Spirit. Avaunt, Satan! Oh, how I thirst for communication with our sister Jolly!" "The communication is already open with the Marsh," said the first. "But as for thee, thou caitiff, who has presumed to disparage my works, I'll have thee rammed into a mortar with a double charge of powder, and thrown into the enemy's quarters." This dialogue operated like a train upon many other inhabitants of the place. One swore he was within 3 vibrations of finding the longitude, when this noise confounded his calculation. A second, in broken English, complained he was disturbed in the moment of deprojection. A third, in the character of His Holiness, denounced interdiction, excommunication, and anathemas, and swore by St. Peter's keys they should howl 10,000 years in purgatory, without the benefit of a single mass. A fourth began to halloo in all the vociferation of a fox hunter in the chase, and in an instant the whole house was in uproar. The clamour, however, was of a short duration. The different chambers being opened successively, every individual was effectually silenced by the sound of one cabalistic word, which was no other than waistcoat, a charm which at once cowed the King of P, dispossessed the fanatic, dumbfounded the mathematician, dismayed the alchemist, deposed the Pope, and deprived the squire of all utterance. Our adventurer was no longer in doubt concerning the place to which he had been conveyed, and the more he reflected on his situation, the more he was overwhelmed with the most perplexing chagrin. He could not conceive by whose means he had been immured in a madhouse, but he heartily repented of his knight-errantry as a frolic which might have very serious consequences with respect to his future life and fortune. After mature deliberation, he resolved to demean himself with the utmost circumspection, well knowing that every violent transport would be interpreted into an undeniable symptom of insanity. He was not without hope of being able to move his gaoler by a due administration of that which is generally more efficacious than all the flowers of elocution. But when he rose in the morning, he found his pockets had been carefully examined and emptied of all his papers and cash. The keeper entering, he inquired about these particulars, and was given to understand that they were all safe deposited for his use, to be forthcoming at a proper season. But at present, as he should want nothing, he had no occasion for money. The knight acquiesced in this declaration, and ate his breakfast in quiet. About 11 he received a visit from the physician, who contemplated his looks with great solemnity, and having examined his pulse, shook his head, saying, "Well, sir, how d'ye do? Come, don't be dejected. Everything is for the best. You are in very good hands, sir, I assure you, and I dare say will refuse nothing that may be thought conducive to the recovery of your health." "Doctor," said our hero, "if it is not an improper question to ask, I should be glad to know your opinion of my disorder." "Oh, sir, as to that," replied the physician, "your disorder is a kind of sir, 'tis very common in this country, a sort of Do you think my distemper is madness, doctor?" "Oh, Lord, sir, not absolute madness, no, not madness. You have heard, no doubt, of what is called a weakness of the nerves, sir? Though that is a very inaccurate expression, for this phrase, denoting a morbid excess of sensation, seems to imply that sensation itself is owing to the loose cohesion of those material particles which constitute the nervous substance, inasmuch as the quantity of every effect must be proportional to its cause. Now you'll please to take notice, sir, if the case were really what these words seem to import, all bodies, whose particles do not cohere with too great a degree of proximity, would be nervous, that is, endued with sensation. Sir, I shall order some cooling things to keep you in due temperature, and you'll do very well. Sir, your humble servant." So saying, he retired, and our adventurer could not but think it was very hard that one man should not dare to ask the most ordinary question without being reputed mad, while another should talk nonsense by the hour, and yet be esteemed as an oracle. The master of the house, finding Sir Launcelot so tame and tractable, indulged him after dinner with a walk in a little private garden, under the eye of a servant who followed him at a distance. Here he was saluted by a brother prisoner, a man seemingly turned of 30, tall and thin, with staring eyes, a hook nose, and a face covered with pimples. The usual compliments having passed, the stranger, without further ceremony, asked him if he would oblige him with a chew of tobacco, or could spare him a mouthful of any sort of cordial, declaring he had not tasted brandy since he came to the house. The knight assured him it was not in his power to comply with his request, and began to ask some questions relating to the character of their landlord, which the stranger represented in very unfavourable colours. He described him as a ruffian, capable of undertaking the darkest scenes of villainy. He said his house was a repository of the most flagrant iniquities, that it contained fathers kidnapped by their children, wives confined by their husbands, gentlemen of fortune sequestered by their relations, and innocent persons immured by the malice of their adversaries. He affirmed this was his own case, and asked if our hero had never heard of Dick Distich, the poet and satirist. "Ben Bullock and I," said he, "were confident against the world in arms. Did you never see his ode to me beginning with 'Fair blooming youth'? We were sworn brothers, admired and praised, and quoted each other, sir. We denounced war against all the world, actors, authors, and critics, and having drawn the sword, threw away the scabbard. We pushed through thick and thin, hacked and hewed helter-skelter, and became as formidable to the writers of the age as the Boeotian band of Thebes. My friend Bullock, indeed, was once rolled in the kennel, but soon he vigorous rose, and from the effluvia strong imbibed new life, and scoured and stunk along." Here is a satire, which I wrote in an alehouse when I was drunk. I can prove it by the evidence of the landlord and his wife. I fancy you'll own I have some right to say with my friend Horace, "Qui me comorit, melius non tangere clamo, flebit et insignis tota cantabitur urbe." The knight, having perused the papers, declared his opinion that the verses were tolerably good, but at the same time observed that the author had reviled as ignorant dunces several persons who had writ with reputation, and were generally allowed to have genius, a circumstance that would detract more from his candour than could be allowed to his capacity. "Damn their genius!" cried the satirist. "A pack of impertinent rascals! I tell you, sir, Ben Bullock and I had determined to crush all that were not of our own party. Besides, I said before, this piece was written in drink. Was you drunk too when it was printed and published? Yes, the printer shall make affidavit that I was never otherwise than drunk or maudlin, till my enemies, on pretence that my brain was turned, conveyed me to this infernal mansion." "They seem to have been your best friends," said the knight, "and have put the most tender interpretation on your conduct; for, waiving the plea of insanity, your character must stand as that of a man who hath some small share of genius, without an atom of integrity. Of all those whom Pope lashed in his Dunciad, there was not one who did not richly deserve the imputation of dullness, and every one of them had provoked the satirist by a personal attack. In this respect the English poet was much more honest than his French pattern, Boileau, who stigmatized several men of acknowledged genius, such as Quinault, Perrault, and the celebrated Lully, for which reason every man of a liberal turn must, in spite of all his poetical merit, despise him as a rancorous knave. If this disingenuous conduct cannot be forgiven in a writer of his superior genius, who will pardon it in you, whose name is not half emerged from obscurity?" "Hark ye, friend," replied the bard, "keep your pardon and your counsel for those who ask it, or, if you will force them upon people, take one piece of advice in return. If you don't like your present situation, apply for a committee without delay. They'll find you too much of a fool to have the least tincture of madness, and you'll be released without further scruple. In that case, I shall rejoice in your deliverance. You will be freed from confinement, and I shall be happily deprived of your conversation." So saying, he flew off at a tangent, and our knight could not help smiling at the peculiar virulence of his disposition. Sir Launcelot then endeavoured to enter into conversation with his attendant, by asking how long Mr. Distich had resided in the house. But he might as well have addressed himself to a Turkish mute. The fellow either pretended ignorance, or refused an answer to every question that was proposed. He would not even disclose the name of his landlord, nor inform him whereabouts the house was situated. Finding himself agitated with impatience and indignation, he returned to his apartment, and the door being locked upon him, began to review, not without horror, the particulars of his fate. "How little reason," said he to himself, "have we to boast of the blessings enjoyed by the British subject, if he holds them on such a precarious tenure; if a man of rank and property may be thus kidnapped even in the midst of the capital; if he may be seized by ruffians, insulted, robbed, and conveyed to such a prison as this, from which there seems to be no possibility of escape. Should I be indulged with pen, ink, and paper, and appeal to my relations, or to the magistrates of my country, my letters would be intercepted by those who superintend my confinement. Should I try to alarm the neighbourhood, my cries would be neglected as those of some unhappy lunatic under necessary correction. Should I employ the force which Heaven has lent me, I might imbrue my hands in blood, and after all find it impossible to escape through a number of successive doors, locks, bolts, and sentinels. Should I endeavour to tamper with the servant, he might discover my design, and then I should be abridged of the little comfort I enjoy. People may inveigh against the Bastille in France and the Inquisition in Portugal, but I would ask if either of these be in reality so dangerous or dreadful as a private madhouse in England, under the direction of a ruffian? The Bastille is a state prison, the Inquisition is a spiritual tribunal, but both are under the direction of government. It seldom, if ever, happens that a man entirely innocent is confined in either, or, if he should, he lays his account with a legal trial before established judges. But, in England, the most innocent person upon earth is liable to be immured for life under the pretext of lunacy, sequestered from his wife, children, and friends, robbed of his fortune, deprived even of necessaries, and subjected to the most brutal treatment from a low-bred barbarian, who raises an ample fortune on the misery of his fellow creatures, and may, during his whole life, practise this horrid oppression without question or control." This uncomfortable reverie was interrupted by a very unexpected sound that seemed to issue from the other side of a thick party wall. It was a strain of vocal music, more plaintive than the widowed turtle's moan, more sweet and ravishing than Philomel's love-warbled song. Through his ear it instantly pierced into his heart, for at once he recognized it to be the voice of his adored Aurelia. Heavens! What was the agitation of his soul when he made this discovery? How did every nerve quiver? How did his heart throb with the most violent emotion? He ran round the room in distraction, foaming like a lion in the toil. Then he placed his ear close to the partition, and listened as if his whole soul was exerted in his sense of hearing. When the sound ceased to vibrate on his ear, he threw himself on the bed. He groaned with anguish, he exclaimed in broken accents, and in all probability his heart would have burst, had not the violence of his sorrow found vent in a flood of tears. These first transports were succeeded by a fit of impatience, which had well nigh deprived him of his senses in good earnest. His surprise at finding his lost Aurelia in such a place, the seeming impossibility of relieving her, and his unspeakable eagerness to contrive some scheme for profiting by the interesting discovery he had made, concurred in brewing up a second ecstasy, during which he acted 1,000 extravagancies, which it was well for him the attendants did not observe. Perhaps it was well for the servant that he did not enter while the paroxysm prevailed. Had this been the case, he might have met with the fate of Lycus, whom Hercules, in his frenzy, destroyed. Before the cloth was laid for supper, he was calm enough to conceal the disorder of his mind. But he complained of the headache, and desired he might be next day visited by the physician, to whom he resolved to explain himself in such a manner as should make an impression upon him, provided he was not altogether destitute of conscience and humanity. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT. Chapter 24. The knot that puzzles human wisdom, the hand of fortune sometimes will untie, familiar as her garter. When the doctor made his next appearance in Sir Launcelot's apartment, the knight addressed him in these words: "Sir, the practice of medicine is one of the most honourable professions exercised among the sons of men, a profession which hath been revered at all periods and in all nations, and even held sacred in the most polished ages of antiquity. The scope of it is to preserve the being and confirm the health of our fellow creatures. Of consequence, to sustain the blessings of society and crown life with fruition. The character of a physician, therefore, not only supposes natural sagacity and acquired erudition, but it also implies every delicacy of sentiment, every tenderness of nature, and every virtue of humanity. That these qualities are centred in you, Doctor, I would willingly believe. But it will be sufficient for my purpose that you are possessed of common integrity. To whose concern I am indebted for your visits, you best know. But if you understand the art of medicine, you must be sensible by this time that, with respect to me, your prescriptions are altogether unnecessary. Come, sir, you cannot. You don't believe that my intellects are disordered. Yet, granting me to be really under the influence of that deplorable malady, no person has a right to treat me as a lunatic, or to sue out a commission, but my nearest kindred. That you may not plead ignorance of my name and family, you shall understand that I am Sir Launcelot Greaves, of the county of York, baronet, and that my nearest relation is Sir Reginald Meadows of Cheshire, the eldest son of my mother's sister, That gentleman, I am sure, had no concern in seducing me by false pretences under the clouds of night into the fields, where I was surprised, overpowered, and kidnapped by armed ruffians. Had he really believed me insane, he would have proceeded according to the dictates of honour, humanity, and the laws of his country. Situated as I am, I have a right, by making application to the Lord Chancellor, to be tried by a jury of honest men. But of that right I cannot avail myself while I remain at the mercy of a brutal miscreant in whose house I am enclosed, unless you contribute your assistance. Your assistance, therefore, I demand, as you are a gentleman, a Christian, and a fellow subject who, though every other motive should be overlooked, ought to interest himself in my case as a common concern, and concur with all your power towards the punishment of those who dare commit such outrages against the liberty of your country." The doctor seemed to be a little disconcerted, but, after some recollection, resumed his air of sufficiency and importance, and assured our adventurer he would do him all the service in his power, but in the meantime advised him to take the potion he had prescribed. The knight's eyes lightening with indignation, "I am now convinced," cried he, "that you are an accomplice in the villainy which has been practised upon me, that you are a sordid wretch, without principle or feeling, a disgrace to the faculty, and a reproach to human nature. Yes, sirrah, you are the most perfidious of all assassins. You are the hireling minister of the worst of all villains, who, from motives even baser than malice, envy, and revenge, rob the innocent of all the comforts of life, brand them with the imputation of madness, the most cruel species of slander, and wantonly protract their misery by leaving them in the most shocking confinement, a prey to reflections infinitely more bitter than death. But I will be calm. Do me justice at your peril. I demand the protection of the legislature. If I am refused, remember a day of reckoning will come. You and the rest of the miscreants who have combined against me must, in order to cloak your treachery, have recourse to murder, an expedient which I believe you very capable of embracing, or a man of my rank and character cannot be much longer concealed. Tremble, caitiff, at the thoughts of my release. In the meantime, begone, lest my just resentment impel me to dash your brains out upon that marble. Away!" The honest doctor was not so firmly persuaded of his patient's lunacy as to reject his advice, which he made what haste he could to follow, when an unexpected accident intervened. That this may be properly introduced, we must return to the knight's brace of trusty friends, Captain Crow and Lawyer Clarke, whom we left in sorrowful deliberation upon the fate of their patron. Clarke's genius being rather more fruitful in resources than that of the seaman, he suggested an advertisement, which was accordingly inserted in the daily papers, importing that, whereas a gentleman of considerable rank and fortune has suddenly disappeared on such a night from his house near Golden Square, in consequence of a letter delivered to him by a porter, and there is great reason to believe some violence hath been offered to his life. Any person capable of giving such information as may tend to clear up this dark transaction shall, by applying to Mr. Thomas Clarke, attorney, at his lodgings in Upper Brook Street, receive proper security for the reward of 100 guineas, to be paid to him upon his making the discovery required. The porter who delivered the letter appeared accordingly, but could give no other information except that it was put into his hand with a shilling by a man muffled up in a greatcoat, who stopped him for the purpose in his passing through Queen Street. It was necessary that the advertisement should produce an effect upon another person, who was no other than the hackney coachman who drove our hero to the place of his imprisonment. This fellow had been enjoined secrecy, and, indeed, bribed to hold his tongue by a considerable gratification, which, it was supposed, would have been effectual, as the man was a master coachman in good circumstances, and well known to the keeper of the madhouse, by whom he had been employed on former occasions of the same nature. Perhaps his fidelity to his employer, reinforced by the hope of many future jobs of that kind, might have been proof against the offer of £50, but double that sum was a temptation he could not resist. He no sooner read the intimation in the Daily Advertiser over his morning's pot at an alehouse, than he entered into consultation with his own thoughts, and, having no reason to doubt that this was the very fare he had conveyed, he resolved to earn the reward, and abstain from all such adventures in time coming. He had the precaution, however, to take an attorney along with him to Mr. Clarke, who entered into a conditional bond, and, with the assistance of his uncle, deposited the money to be forthcoming when the conditions should be fulfilled. These previous measures being taken, the coachman declared what he knew, and discovered the house in which Sir Launcelot had been immured. He, moreover, accompanied our two adherents to a judge's chamber, where he made oath to the truth of his information, and a warrant was immediately granted to search the house of Bernard Shackle, and set at liberty Sir Launcelot Greaves, if there found. Fortified with this authority, they engaged a constable, with a formidable posse, and, embarking them in coaches, repaired with all possible expedition to the house of Mr. Shackle, who did not think proper to dispute their claim, but admitted them, though not without betraying evident symptoms of consternation. One of the servants directing them, by his master's order, to Sir Launcelot's apartment, they hurried upstairs in a body, occasioning such a noise as did not fail to alarm the physician, who had just opened the door to retire, when he perceived their irruption. Captain Crow, conjecturing he was guilty from the confusion that appeared in his countenance, made no scruple of seizing him by the collar as he endeavoured to retreat, while the tender-hearted Tom Clarke, running up to the knight, with his eyes brimful of joy and affection, forgot all the forms of distant respect, and throwing his arms round his neck, blubbered in his bosom. Our hero did not receive this proof of attachment unmoved. He strained him in his embrace, honoured him with the title of his deliverer, and asked him by what miracle he had discovered the place of his confinement. The lawyer began to unfold the various steps he had taken with equal minuteness and self-complacency, when Crow, dragging the doctor still by the collar, shook his old friend by the hand, protesting he was never so overjoyed since he got clear of a Sally Rover on the coast of Barbary, and that 2 glasses ago he would have started all the money he had in the world in the hold of any man who would have shown Sir Launcelot safe at his moorings. The knight, having made a proper return to this sincere manifestation of goodwill, desired him to dismiss that worthless fellow, meaning the doctor, who, finding himself released, withdrew with some precipitation. Then our adventurer, attended by his friends, walked off with a deliberate pace to the outward gate, which he found open, and getting into one of the coaches, was entertained by the way to his own house with a detail of every measure which had been pursued for his release. In his own parlour he found Mrs. Dolly Cowslip, who had been waiting with great fear and impatience for the issue of Mr. Clarke's adventure. She now fell upon her knees and bathed the knight's hands with tears of joy, while the face of this young woman recalling the idea of her mistress, roused his heart to strong emotions, and stimulated his mind to the immediate achievement he had already planned. As for Mr. Crabshaw, he was not the last to signify his satisfaction at his master's return. After having kissed the hem of his garment, he retired to the stable, where he communicated these tidings to his friend Gilbert, whom he saddled and bridled. The same office he performed for Bronze Marte. Then, putting on his squire-like attire and accoutrements, he mounted one and led the other to the knight's door, before which he paraded, uttering, from time to time, repeated shouts, to the no small entertainment of the populace, until he received orders to house his companions. Thus commanded, he led them back to their stalls, resumed his livery, and rejoined his fellow servants, who were resolved to celebrate the day with banquets and rejoicings. Their master's heart was not sufficiently at ease to share in their festivity. He held a consultation with his friends in the parlour, whom he acquainted with the reasons he had to believe Miss Darnell was confined in the same house which had been his prison, a circumstance which filled them with equal pleasure and astonishment. Dolly in particular, weeping plentifully, conjured him to deliver her dear lady without delay. Nothing now remained but to concert the plan for her deliverance. As Aurelia had informed Dolly of her connection with Mrs. Caudle, at whose house she proposed to lodge, before she was overtaken on the road by her uncle, this particular was now imparted to the council, and struck a light which seemed to point out the direct way to Miss Darnell's enlargement. Our hero, accompanied by Mrs. Cowslip and Tom Clark, set out immediately for the house of Dr. Caudle, who happened to be abroad, but his wife received them with great courtesy. She was a well-bred, sensible, genteel woman, and strongly attached to Aurelia by the ties of affection as well as of consanguinity. She no sooner learned the situation of her cousin than she expressed the most impatient concern for her being set at liberty, and assured Sir Launcelot she would concur in any scheme he should propose for that purpose. There was no room for hesitation or choice. He attended her immediately to the judge, who, upon proper application, issued another search warrant for Aurelia Darnell. The constable and his posse were again retained, and Sir Launcelot Greaves once more crossed the threshold of Mr. Bernard Shackle. Nor was the search warrant the only implement of justice with which he had furnished himself for this visit. In going thither they agreed upon the method in which they should introduce themselves gradually to Miss Darnell, that her tender nature might not be too much shocked by their sudden appearance. When they arrived at the house, therefore, and produced their credentials, in consequence of which a female attendant was directed to show the ladies' apartment, Mrs. Dolly first entered the chamber of the accomplished Aurelia, who, lifting up her eyes, screamed aloud, and flew into the arms of her faithful Cowslip. Some minutes elapsed before Dolly could make shift to exclaim, "I'm come to live and die with my beloved lady." "Dear Dolly," cried her mistress, "I cannot express the pleasure I have in seeing you again. Good heaven! What solitary hours of keen affliction have I passed since we parted! But tell me, how did you discover the place of my retreat? Has my uncle relented? Do I owe your coming to his indulgence?" Dolly answered in the negative, and by degrees gave her to understand that her cousin Mrs. Caudle was in the next room. That lady immediately appeared, and a very tender scene of recognition passed between the two relations. It was she who, in the course of conversation, perceiving that Aurelia was perfectly composed, declared the happy tidings of her approaching deliverance. When the other eagerly insisted upon knowing to whose humanity and address she was indebted for this happy turn of fortune, her cousin declared the obligation was due to a young gentleman of Yorkshire, called Sir Launcelot Greaves. At mention of that name her face was overspread with a crimson glow, and her eyes beamed redoubled splendour. "Cousin," said she with a sigh, "I know not what to say. That gentleman, Sir Launcelot Greaves, was surely born— Lord bless me! I tell you, cousin, he has been my guardian angel." Mrs. Caudle, who had maintained a correspondence with her by letters, was no stranger to the former part of the connection subsisting between those two lovers, and had always favoured the pretensions of our hero without being acquainted with his person. She now observed with a smile that as Aurelia esteemed the knight her guardian angel, and he adored her as a demi-deity, nature seemed to have intended them for each other; for such sublime ideas exalted them both above the sphere of ordinary mortals. She then ventured to intimate that he was in the house, impatient to pay his respects in person. At this declaration the colour vanished from her cheeks, which, however, soon underwent a total suffusion. Her heart panted, her bosom heaved, and her gentle frame was agitated by transports rather violent than unpleasing. She soon, however, recollected herself, and her native serenity returned, when, rising from her seat, she declared she would see him in the next apartment, where he stood in the most tumultuous suspense, waiting for permission to approach her person. Here she broke in upon him, arrayed in an elegant white undress, the emblem of her purity, beaming forth the emanations of amazing beauty, warmed and improved with a glow of gratitude and affection. His heart was too big for utterance. He ran towards her with rapture, and throwing himself at her feet, imprinted a most respectful kiss upon her lily hand. "This, divine Aurelia," cried he, "is a foretaste of that ineffable bliss which you were born to bestow. Do I then live to see you smile again? To see you restored to liberty, your mind at ease, and your health unimpaired?" "You have lived," said she, "to see my obligations to Sir Launcelot Greaves accumulated in such a manner that a whole life spent in acknowledgment will scarce suffice to demonstrate a due sense of his goodness." "You greatly overrate my services, which have been rather the duties of common humanity than the efforts of a generous passion, too noble to be thus evinced. But let not my unseasonable transports detain you a moment longer on this detested scene. Give me leave to hand you into the coach, and commit you to the care of this good lady, attended by this honest young gentleman, who is my particular friend." So saying, he presented Mr. Thomas Clarke, who had the honour to salute the fair hand of the ever amiable Aurelia. The ladies being safely coached under the escort of the lawyer, Sir Launcelot assured them he should wait on them in the evening at the house of Dr. Caudle, whither they immediately directed their course. Our hero, who remained with the constable and his gang, inquired for Mr. Bernard Shackle, upon whose person he intended to serve a writ of conspiracy over and above a prosecution for robbery, in consequence of his having disencumbered the knight of his money and other effects on the first night of his confinement. Mr. Shackle had discretion enough to avoid this encounter, and even to anticipate the indictment for felony, by directing one of his servants to restore the cash and papers, which our adventurer accordingly received before he quitted the house. In the prosecution of his search after Shackle, he chanced to enter the chamber of the bard, whom he found in dishabille, writing at a table, with a bandage over one eye, and his head covered with a nightcap of baize. The knight, having made an apology for this intrusion, desired to know if he could be of any service to Mr. Distich. as he was now at liberty to use the little influence he had for the relief of his fellow sufferers. The poet having eyed him for some time askance, "I told you," said he, "your stay in this place would be of short duration. I have sustained a small disaster on my left eye from the hands of a rascally cordwainer who pretends to believe himself the King of Prussia, and I am now in the very act of galling his Majesty with keen iambes. If you can help me to a roll of tobacco and a bottle of Geneva, so. If you are not so inclined, your humble servant, I shall share in the joy of your deliverance." The knight declined gratifying him in these particulars, which he apprehended might be prejudicial to his health, but offered his assistance in redressing his grievances, provided he laboured under any cruel treatment or inconvenience. "I comprehend the full extent of your generosity," replied the satirist. "You are willing to assist me in everything, except the only circumstances in which assistance is required. God be with you. If you see Ben Bullock, tell him I wish he would not dedicate any more of his works to me. Damn the fellow! He has changed his note, and begins to snivel. For my part, I stick to my former maxim, defy all the world, and will die hard, even if death should be preceded by damnation." The knight, finding him incorrigible, left him to the slender chance of being one day comforted by the dram bottle, but resolved, if possible, to set on foot an accurate inquiry into the economy and transactions of this private inquisition, that ample justice might be done in favour of every injured individual confined within its walls. In the afternoon he did not fail to visit his Aurelia, and all the protestations of their mutual passion were once more interchanged. He now produced the letter which had caused such fatal disquiet in his bosom, and Miss Darnell no sooner eyed the paper than she recollected it was a formal dismission which she had intended and directed for Mr. Sycamore. This the uncle had intercepted and cunningly enclosed in another cover addressed to Sir Launcelot Greaves, who was now astonished beyond measure to see the mystery so easily unfolded. The joy that now diffused itself in the hearts of our lovers is more easily conceived than described, but in order to give a stability to this mutual satisfaction, it was necessary that Aurelia should be secured from the tyranny of her uncle, whose power of guardianship would not otherwise expire for some months. Dr. Caudle and his lady having entered into their deliberations on the subject, it was agreed that Miss Darnell should have recourse to the protection of the Lord Chancellor. But such application was rendered unnecessary by the unexpected arrival of John Clump with the following letter to Mrs. Caudle from the steward of Anthony Darnell, dated at Aurelia's house in the country. "Madam, it hath pleased God to afflict Mr. Darnell with a severe stroke of the dead palsy. He was taken ill yesterday, and now lies insensible, seemingly at the point of death. Among the papers in his pocket I found the enclosed, by which it appears that my honoured young lady, Miss Darnell, is confined in a private madhouse. I am afraid Mr. Darnell's fate is a just judgment of God upon him for his cruelty to that excellent person. I need not exhort you, madam, to take immediately upon the receipt of this such measures as will be necessary for the enlargement of my poor young lady. In the meantime, I shall do the needful for the preservation of her property in this place, and send you an account of any further alteration that may happen, being very respectfully, madam, your most obedient humble servant, Ralph Mattox." Clump had posted up to London with this intimation on the wings of love, and being covered with clay from the heels to the eyes upwards, he appeared in such an unfavourable light at Dr. Caudle's door that the footman refused him admittance. Nevertheless, he pushed him aside and fought his way upstairs into the dining-room, where the company was not a little astonished at such an apparition. The fellow himself was no less amazed at seeing Aurelia and his own sweetheart, Mrs. Dolly Cowslip. He forthwith fell upon his knees, and in silence held out the letter, which was taken by the doctor and presented to his wife, according to the direction. She did not fail to communicate the contents, which were far from being unwelcome, to the individuals who composed this little society. Mr. Clump was honoured with the approbation of his young lady, who commended him for his zeal and expedition, bestowed upon him a handsome gratuity in the meantime, and desired to see him again when he should be properly refreshed after the fatigue he had undergone. Mr. Thomas Clarke, being consulted on this occasion, gave it as his opinion that Miss Darnell should, without delay, choose another guardian for the few months that remained of her minority. The opinion was confirmed by the advice of some eminent lawyers, to whom immediate recourse was had, and Dr. Caudle being the person pitched upon for this office, the necessary forms were executed with all possible dispatch. The first use the doctor made of his guardianship was to sign a power constituting Mr. Ralph Mattox his attorney pro tempore for managing the estate of Miss Aurelia Darnell, and this was forwarded to the steward by the hands of Clump, who set out with it for the seat of Darnell Hill, though not without a heavy heart, occasioned by some intimation he had received concerning the connection between his dear Dolly and Mr. Clarke, the lawyer. End of chapter 24. Chapter the last of the life and adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT. Chapter the last, which, it is to be hoped, will be, on more accounts than one, agreeable to the reader. Sir Launcelot, having vindicated the liberty, confirmed the safety, and secured the heart of his charming Aurelia, now found leisure to unravel the conspiracy which had been executed against his person, and with that view commenced a lawsuit against the owner of the house where he and his mistress had been separately confined. Mr. Shackle was, notwithstanding all the submissions and atonement which he offered to make, either in private or in public, indicted on the statute of kidnapping, tried, convicted, punished by a severe fine, and standing in the pillory. A judicial writ ad inquirendum being executed, the prisons of his inquisition were laid open, and several innocent captives enlarged. In the course of Shackle's trial, it appeared that the night's confinement was a scheme executed by his rival Mr. Sycamore, according to the device of his counsellor, Dawdle, who, by this contrivance, had reconciled himself to his patron after having deserted him in the day of battle. Our hero was so incensed at this discovery of Sycamore's treachery and ingratitude that he went in quest of him immediately to take vengeance on his person, accompanied by Captain Crow, who wanted to balance accounts with Mr. Dawdle. But those gentlemen had wisely avoided the impending storm by retiring to the Continent on pretence of travelling for improvement. Sir Launcelot was not now so much of a knight-errant as to leave Aurelia to the care of Providence, and pursue the traitors to the farthest extremities of the earth. He practised a much more easy, certain, and effectual method of revenge, by instituting a process against them which, after writs of capias, alias, et pluris had been repeated, subjected them both to outlawry. Mr. Sycamore and his friend, being thus deprived of the benefit of the law by their own neglect, would likewise have forfeited their goods and chattels to the king, had they not made such submissions as appeased the wrath of Sir Launcelot and Captain Crow. Then they ventured to return, and by dint of interest obtained a reversal of the outlawry. But this grace they did not enjoy till long after our adventurer was happily established in life. While the knight waited impatiently for the expiration of Aurelia's minority, and in the meantime consoled himself with the imperfect happiness arising from her conversation, and those indulgences which the most unblemished virtue could bestow, Captain Crow projected another plan of vengeance against the conjurer, whose lying oracles had cost him such a world of vexation. The truth is, the captain began to be tired of idleness, and undertook this adventure to keep his hand in use. He imparted his design to Crabshaw, who had likewise suffered in spirit from the predictions of the said offender, and was extremely well disposed to assist in punishing the false prophet. He now took it for granted that he should not be hanged for stealing a horse, and thought it very hard to pay so much money for a deceitful prophecy, which, in all likelihood, would never be fulfilled. Actuated by these motives, they set out together for the house of consultation, but they found it shut up and abandoned, and, upon inquiry in the neighbourhood, learned that the conjurer had moved his quarters that very day on which the captain had recourse to his art. This was actually the case. He knew the fate of Sir Launcelot would soon come to light, and he did not choose to wait the consequence. He had other motives for decamping. He had run a score at the public house, which he had no mind to discharge, and wanted to disengage himself from his female associate, who knew too much of his affairs to be kept at a proper distance. All these purposes he had answered by retreating softly, without beat of drum, while his Sibyl was abroad running down prey for his devouring. He had not, however, taken his measures so cunningly but that this old hag discovered his new lodgings, and in revenge gave information to the publican. This creditor took out a writ accordingly, and the bailiff had just secured his person as Captain Crow and Timothy Crabshaw chanced to pass by the door in their way homewards, through an obscure street near the 7 Dials. The conjurer, having no subterfuge left, but a great many particular reasons for avoiding an explanation with the justice, like the man between the devil and the deep blue sea, of two evils chose the least, and beckoning to the captain, called him by his name. Crow, thus addressed, replied with a "Lower!" and looking towards the place from whence he was hailed, at once recognized the necromancer. Without farther hesitation he sprang across the street, and collaring Albumazar, exclaimed, "Aha, old boy, is the wind in that corner? I thought we should grapple one day. Now will I bring you up by the head, though all the devils in hell were blowing abaft the beam." The bailiff, seeing his prisoner so rough-handled before, and at the same time assaulted behind by Crabshaw, who cried, "Show me a liar, and I'll show you a thief. Who is to be hanged now, I say?" The bailiff, fearing he should lose the benefit of his job, began to put on his contentious face, and declaring the doctor was his prisoner, swore he could not surrender him without a warrant from the Lord Chief Justice. The whole group adjourning into the parlour, the conjurer desired to know of Crow whether Sir Launcelot was found. Being answered, "Ay, safe enough to see you made fast in the bilboes, brother," he told the captain he had something of consequence to communicate for his advantage, and proposed that Crow and Crabshaw should bail the action, which lay only for a debt of £3. Crow stormed, and Crabshaw grinned at this modest proposal, but when they understood that they could only be bound for his appearance, and reflected that they need not part with him until his body should be surrendered unto justice, they consented to give bail, and the bond being executed, conveyed him directly to the house of our adventurer. The boisterous Crow introduced him to Sir Launcelot with such an abrupt, unconnected detail of his offence as the knight could not understand without Timothy's annotations. These were followed by some questions put to the conjurer, who, laying aside his black gown and plucking off his white beard, exhibited to the astonished spectators the very individual countenance of the empirical politician Ferret, who had played our hero such a slippery trick after the electioneering adventure. "I perceive," said he, "you are preparing to expostulate and upbraid me for having given a false information against you to the country justice. I look upon mankind to be in a state of nature, a truth which Hobbes has stumbled upon by accident. I think every man has a right to avail himself of his talents, even at the expense of his fellow creatures, just as we see the fish and other animals of the creation devouring one another. I found the justice but one degree removed from idiotism, and knowing that he would commit some blunder in the execution of his office which would lay him at your mercy, I contrived to make his folly the instrument of my escape. I was dismissed without being obliged to sign the information I had given, and you took ample vengeance for his tyranny and impertinence. I came to London, where my circumstances obliged me to live in disguise. In the character of a conjurer, I was consulted by your follower Crow and your squire Crabshaw. I did little or nothing but echo back the intelligence they brought me, except prognosticating that Crabshaw would be hanged, a prediction to which I found myself so irresistibly impelled that I am persuaded it was the real effect of inspiration. I am now arrested for a paltry sum of money, and moreover liable to be sent to Bridewell as an impostor. Let those answer for my conduct whose cruelty and insolence have driven me to the necessity of using such subterfuges. I have been oppressed and persecuted by the government for speaking truth. Your omnipotent laws have reconciled contradictions. That which is acknowledged to be truth in fact is construed falsehood in law, and great reason we have to boast of a constitution founded on the basis of absurdity. But, waiving these remarks, I own I am unwilling to be either imprisoned for debt or punished for imposture. I know how far to depend upon generosity and what is called benevolence, words to amuse the weak-minded. I build upon a surer bottom. I will bargain for your assistance. It is in my power to put £12,000 in the pocket of Samuel Crow, that there sea ruffian, who by his good will would hang me to the yard's arm. There he was interrupted by the seaman. "Damn your rat's eyes, none of you hang thee! Fish my topmasts! If the rope was fairly reeved and the tackle sound, d'ye see?" Mr. Clark, who was present, began to stare, while the knight assured Ferret that if he was really able and willing to serve Captain Crow in anything essential, he should be amply rewarded. In the meantime he discharged the debt and assigned him an apartment in his own house. That same day Crow, by the advice of Sir Launcelot and his nephew, entered into conditional articles with the Cynic to allow him the interest of £1,500 for life, provided by this means the captain should obtain possession of the estate of Hobbyhole in Yorkshire, which had belonged to his grandfather, and of which he was heir of blood. This bond being executed, Mr. Ferret discovered that he himself was the lawful husband of Bridget Maple, aunt to Samuel Crow, by a clandestine marriage, which, however, he convinced them he could prove by undeniable evidence. This being the case, she, the said Bridget Maple, alias Ferret, was a covert femme, consequently could not transact any deed of alienation without his concurrence. Ergo, the docking of the entail of the estate of Hobbyhole was illegal and of none effect. This was a very agreeable declaration to the whole company, who did not fail to congratulate Captain Crow on the prospect of his being restored to his inheritance. Tom Clark in particular protested, with tears in his eyes, that it gave him unspeakable joy, and his tears trickled the faster when Crow, with an arch look, signified that now he was pretty well victualled for life, he had some thoughts of embarking on the voyage of matrimony. But that point of happiness to which, as the North Pole, the course of these adventures hath been invariably directed, was still unattained. We mean the indissoluble union of the accomplished Sir Launcelot Greaves and the enchanting Miss Darnell. Our hero now discovered in his mistress 1,000 charms which hitherto he had no opportunity to contemplate. He found her beauty excelled by her good sense, and her virtue superior to both. He found her untainted by that giddiness, vanity, and affectation which distinguish the fashionable females of the present age. He found her uninfected by the rage for diversion and dissipation, for noise, tumult, gewgaws, glitter, and extravagance. He found her not only raised by understanding and taste far above the amusement of little vulgar minds, but even exalted by uncommon genius and refined reflection, so as to relish the more sublime enjoyments of rational pleasure. He found her possessed of that vigour of mind which constitutes true fortitude and vindicates the empire of reason. He found her heart incapable of disguise or dissimulation, frank, generous, and open, susceptible of the most tender impressions, glowing with a keen sense of honour and melting with humanity. A youth of his sensibility could not fail of being deeply affected by such attractions. The nearer he approached the centre of happiness, the more did the velocity of his passion increase. Her uncle still remained insensible, as it were in the arms of death. Time seemed to linger in its lapse, till the knight was inflamed to the most eager degree of impatience. He communicated his distress to Aurelia. He pressed her with the most pathetic remonstrances to abridge the torture of his suspense. He interested Mrs. Caudle in his behalf, and at length his importunities succeeded. The banns of marriage were regularly published, and the ceremony was performed in the parish church, in the presence of Dr. Caudle and his lady, Captain Crow, Lawyer Clark, and Mrs. Dolly Cowslip. The bride, instead of being disguised in tawdry stuffs of gold and silver, and sweating under a harness of diamonds, according to the elegant taste of the times, appeared in a negligée of plain blue satin, without any other jewels than her eyes, which far outshone all that ever was produced by the mines of Golconda. Her hair had no other extraneous ornament than a small sprig of artificial roses, but the dignity of her air, the elegance of her shape, the sweetness and sensibility of her countenance, added to such warmth of colouring and such exquisite symmetry of features as could not be excelled by human nature, attracted the eyes and excited the admiration of all the beholders. The effect they produced in the heart of Sir Launcelot was such a rapture as we cannot pretend to describe. He made his appearance on this occasion in a white coat and blue satin vest, both embroidered with silver, and all who saw him could not but own that he alone seemed worthy to possess the lady whom Heaven had destined for his consort. Captain Crow had taken off a blue suit of clothes strongly guarded with bars of broad gold lace, in order to honour the nuptials of his friend. He wore upon his head a bag-wig, à la pigeon, made by an old acquaintance in Wapping, and to his side he had girded a huge plate-hilted sword, which he had bought of a recruiting sergeant. Mr. Clark was dressed in pompadour with gold buttons, and his lovely Dolly in a smart checked lutestring, a present from her mistress. The whole company dined, by invitation, at the house of Dr. Caudle, and here it was that the most deserving lovers on the face of the earth attained to the consummation of all earthly felicity. The captain and his nephew had a hint to retire in due time. Mrs. Caudle conducted the amiable Aurelia, trembling, to the marriage bed. Our hero, glowing with a bridegroom's ardour, claimed the husband's privilege. Hymen lighted up his brightest torch at virtue's lamp, and every star shed its happiest influence on their heaven-directed union. Instructions had been already dispatched to prepare Greavesbury Hall for the reception of its new mistress, and for that place the new married couple set out next morning, according to the plan which had been previously concerted. Sir Launcelot and Lady Greaves, accompanied by Mrs. Caudle and attended by Dolly, travelled in their own coach, drawn by 6 dappled horses. Dr. Caudle, with Captain Crow, occupied the doctor's post-chariot, provided with 4 bays. Mr. Clarke had the honour to bestride the loins of Bronza Marte. Mr. Ferret was mounted upon an old hunter. Crabshaw stuck close to his friend Gilbert, and 2 other horsemen completed the retinue. There was not an aching heart in the whole cavalcade, except that of the young lawyer, which was by turns invaded with hot desires and chilling scruples. Though he was fond of Dolly to distraction, his regard to worldly reputation and his attention to worldly interest were continually raising up bars to a legal gratification of his love. His pride was startled at the thought of marrying the daughter of a poor country publican, and he moreover dreaded the resentment of his Uncle Crow should he take any step of this nature without his concurrence. Many a wishful look did he cast at Dolly, the tears standing in his eyes, and many a woeful sigh did he utter. Lady Greaves immediately perceived the situation of his heart, and, by questioning Mrs. Cowslip, discovered a mutual passion between these lovers. She consulted her dear knight on the subject, and he catechised the lawyer, who pleaded guilty. The captain, being sounded as to his opinion, declared he would be steered in that, as well as every other course of life, by Sir Launcelot and his lady, whom he verily revered as being of an order superior to the ordinary race of mankind. This favourable response being obtained from the sailor, our hero took an opportunity on the road, one day after dinner, in presence of the whole company, to accost the lawyer in these words: "My good friend Clarke, I have your happiness very much at heart. Your father was an honest man, to whom my family had manifold obligations. I have had these many years a personal regard for yourself, derived from your own integrity of heart and goodness of disposition. I see you are affected, and shall be brief. Besides this regard, I am indebted to your friendship for the liberty, what shall I say, for the inestimable happiness I now enjoy in possessing the most excellent— But I understand that significant glance of my Aurelia. I will not offend her delicacy. The truth is, my obligation is very great, and it is time I should evince my gratitude. If the stewardship of my estate is worth your acceptance, you shall have it immediately, together with the house and farm of Cockerton in my neighbourhood. I know you have a passion for Mrs. Dolly, and believe she looks upon you with the eyes of tender prepossession. Don't blush, Dolly. Besides your agreeable person, which all the world must approve, you can boast of virtue, fidelity, and friendship. Your attachment to Lady Greaves neither she nor I shall ever forget. If you are willing to unite your fate with Mr. Clarke, your mistress gives me leave to assure you she will stock the farm at her own expense, and we will celebrate the wedding at Greavesbury Hall." By this time the hearts of these grateful lovers had overflowed. Dolly was sitting on her knees, bathing her lady's hand with her tears, and Mr. Clarke appeared in the same attitude by Sir Launcelot. The uncle, almost as affected as the nephew by the generosity of our adventurer, cried aloud, "I pray God that you and your glorious consort may have smooth seas and gentle gales whithersoever you are bound. As for my kinsman Tom, I'll give him £1,000 to set him fairly afloat, and if he prove not a faithful tender to you his benefactor, I hope he will founder in this world, and be damned in that which is to come." Nothing now was wanting to the completion of their happiness but the consent of Dolly's mother at the Black Lion, whom they did not suppose could have any objection to such an advantageous match for her daughter. But in this particular they were mistaken. In the meantime they arrived at the village where the knight had exercised the duties of chivalry, and there he received the gratulation of Mr. Phillet and the attorney who had offered to bail him before Justice Gobble. Mutual civilities having passed, they gave him to understand that Gobble and his wife were turned Methodists. All the rest of the prisoners whom he had delivered came to testify their gratitude, and were hospitably entertained. Next day they halted at the Black Lion, where the good woman was overjoyed to see Dolly so happily preferred. But when Sir Launcelot unfolded the proposed marriage, she interrupted him with a scream. "Christ Jesus forbid! Marry and amen! Match with her own brother!" At this exclamation Dolly fainted. Her lover stood with his ears erect and his mouth wide open. Crow stared, while the knight and his lady expressed equal surprise and concern. When Sir Launcelot entreated Mrs. Cowslip to explain this mystery, she told him that about 16 years ago Mr. Clarke, senior, had brought Dolly, then an infant, to her house, when she and her late husband lived in another part of the country, and, as she had then been lately delivered of a child which did not live, he hired her as a nurse to the little foundling. He owned she was a love-begotten babe, and from time to time paid handsomely for the board of Dolly, whom he desired might pass for her own daughter. In his last illness he assured her he had taken care to provide for the child, but since his death she had received no account of any such provision. She moreover informed his honour that Mr. Clarke had deposited in her hands a diamond ring and a sealed paper, never to be opened without his order, until Dolly should be demanded in marriage by the man she should like, and not then, except in the presence of the clergyman of the parish. "Send for the clergyman this instant," cried our hero, reddening and fixing his eyes on Dolly. "I hope all will yet be well." The vicar arriving, and being made acquainted with the nature of the case, the landlady produced the paper, which, being opened, appeared to be an authentic certificate that the person commonly known by the name of Dorothy Cowslip was in fact Dorothy Greaves, daughter of Jonathan Greaves, Esquire, by a young gentlewoman who had been some years deceased. "The remaining part of the mystery I myself can unfold," exclaimed the knight, while he ran and embraced the astonished Dolly as his kinswoman. "Jonathan Greaves was my uncle, and died before he came of age, so that he could make no settlement on his child, the fruit of a private amour, founded on a promise of marriage of which this ring was a token. Mr. Clarke, being his confidant, disposed of the child, and at length, finding his constitution decay, revealed the secret to my father, who in his will bequeathed £100 a year to this agreeable foundling. But, as they both died while I was abroad, and some of the memorandums touching this transaction probably were mislaid, I never till now could discover where or how my pretty cousin was situated. I shall recompense the good woman for her care and fidelity, and take pleasure in bringing this affair to a happy issue." The lovers were now overwhelmed with transports of joy and gratitude, and every countenance was lighted up with satisfaction. From this place to the habitation of Sir Launcelot the bells were rung in every parish, and the corporation in their formalities congratulated him in every town through which he passed. About 5 miles from Greavesbury Hall he was met by above 5,000 persons of both sexes and every age, dressed out in their gayest apparel, headed by Mr. Ralph Mattox from Darnell Hill, and the rector from the knight's own parish. They were preceded by music of different kinds, ranged under a great variety of flags and ensigns, and the women as well as the men bedizened with fancy knots and marriage favours. At the end of the avenue a select bevy of comely virgins arrayed in white, and a separate band of choice youths, distinguished by garlands of laurel and holly interweaved, fell into the procession, and sung in chorus a rustic epithalamium composed by the curate. At the gate they were received by the venerable housekeeper, Mrs. Oakley, whose features were so brightened by the occasion that with the first glance she made a conquest of the heart of Captain Crow, and this connection was improved afterwards into a legal conjunction. Meanwhile the houses of Greavesbury Hall and Darnell Hill were set open for the entertainment of all comers, and both echoed with the sounds of festivity. After the ceremony of giving and receiving visits had been performed by Sir Launcelot Greaves and his lady, Mr. Clarke was honoured with the hand of the agreeable Miss Dolly Greaves, and the captain was put in possession of his paternal estate. The perfect and uninterrupted felicity of the knight and his endearing consort diffused itself through the whole adjacent country, as far as their example and influence could extend. They were admired, esteemed, and applauded by every person of taste, sentiment, and benevolence; at the same time beloved, revered, and almost adored by the common people, among whom they suffered not the merciless hand of indigence or misery to seize one single sacrifice. Ferret at first seemed to enjoy his easy circumstances, but the novelty of this situation soon wore off, and all his misanthropy returned. He could not bear to see his fellow creatures happy around him, and signified his disgust to Sir Launcelot, declaring his intention of returning to the metropolis, where he knew there would always be food sufficient for the ravenous appetite of his spleen. Before he departed, the knight made him partake of his bounty, though he could not make him taste of his happiness, which soon received a considerable addition in the birth of a son, destined to be the heir and representative of two worthy families, whose mutual animosity the union of his parents had so happily extinguished. End of chapter the last. Recording by Jennifer Painter. End of the Life and Adventures of Sir Launcelot Greaves by Tobias SMOLLETT.